Welcome everybody in the room and everybody online to our work session on Tuesday, April 11th of the 15th County Board of Commissioners. And we have with us today the aspirant, or rather the, yes, it is.
Just move it closer, thanks.
The Airport Advisory Board. And Jackie will be helping me run this meeting. In fact, she'll be running most of the meeting. This is a joint gathering of appointed members of the AAB. It's not the entire AAB. They definitely wouldn't fit in this room. These people have been selected to provide advice and recommendations to the BOCC. So the Airport Advisory Board requested a meeting with the FAA in order to get clarity to a number of questions and statements circulating in the community. It's the BOCC and AAB's, sorry for the acronyms, desire to hear directly from the FAA on very complicated issues that seem to have differing interpretations. So I'd like to introduce John Bauer. He is with the Denver Airports District Office, the ADO. He is responsible for overseeing the airport improvement program for Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming. He's been with the Denver ADO since 1996, and his work includes engineering, the planning programs, compliance, fiscal control, and environmental planning activities. Thank you very much, John, for being here today. And with that, I will turn it over to Jackie.
All right, thanks, Francie. And I want to welcome everyone here from the AAB, the BOCC, the press, and the public. We are going to be getting through a long list of questions today. This isn't about discussion. This isn't about negotiation. This is actually about getting answers from John Bauer from the FAA. And we are going to be going quite fast. We are going to be leaving some time, hopefully, at the end for Airport Advisory Board questions, BOCC questions and clarification, and then I will take some questions from the press and hopefully have some time for any questions from the public. It is not about discussion right now. We will save discussion for another meeting. We have been working for a couple years to get these questions answered from the FAA, and so John Bauer is going to be on the hot seat. So I am going to start, though, right now with Brad Jacobson, who is leading the airport layout planning process. So, Brad, take it away.
Thank you, Jackie. So as part of the ALP update, we were tasked with developing a 20-year forecast of aviation activity at the airport. Using industry standard forecasting methods and based on the data, we came up with a range of potential forecast outcomes. Now, the FAA requires that we submit a single, most likely forecast outcome for their approval that we can use for facility planning purposes going forward. So in contemplating how we selected which of the scenarios would be the most likely outcome, we considered a number of factors, chief among them the community's feedback and input from the common ground recommendations and the visioning process, the community goals, as well as input and feedback from our friends at the FAA. Now, unfortunately, as is sometimes the case, those two positions, the community position and the FAA position, did not align perfectly. So as we prepare the final detailed draft forecast that we will present to the Airport Advisory Board next week, we thought it would be very helpful if the FAA could address the community directly and answer some of these questions and provide some context and some clarity and some understanding around these issues where we're not exactly aligned. So that's where we're at today. Those are my comments.
Okay, thanks, Brad.
You're welcome.
All right, so I'm going to be setting a timer for every question so that we can keep this moving along, and I would appreciate it if the AAB and the BOCC write down any questions and don't interrupt as we're going forward, and then we can ask all those questions at the end. Okay? All right. John, are you ready?
Ready?
Okay.
Sorry.
Sounds like
Lulled me to sleep. Thanks.
sounds like a game show.
Okay, why, from the FAA's perspective, are changes needed at the Aspen Pitkin County Airport? And with respect to those changes, what is the FAA's role?
So shortest question, maybe one of the longest answers of the day. So I would start by saying every answer I give to any questions you have are going to be centered around safety and access. So if you can kind of frame that in your thinking when you're asking the question and my responses, I think we're going to do great. The other piece of that is the restriction side of things. You know, we hear a lot from communities about restricting growth, restricting the type of aircraft that come in. And we can talk more about that as the meeting goes on, I'm sure we will. But those really are not allowed from your federal grant assurances. So from our perspective, FAA's perspective on changes needed at the airport, so you got to rewind quite a ways back. Pretty much back to 2012, 2013, we started having some conversations during a master planning effort. And during that effort, the airport had put forward another mod request for a west side taxiway at 320 feet. And we replied at that time that we don't support a mod at 320 feet and that we would continue to work with the county to coordinate the differences between our positions.
Please tell us what a mod is.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much. I come from an agency that is largely driven by acronyms, so I felt right at home when we started the meeting, and most of it was acronyms, so I appreciate you. Modification of standard, basically. We call them MOSs, but the mod is modification. So it's a modification to design standards. So the standard separation for runway taxiway for a design group 3 is 400 feet. Right now, you currently have 320 feet on the east side. You were proposing 320 feet on the west side. We said we weren't going to buy into that, and we needed to have some conversations. That launched a whole series of air service studies. I'm sure you're all familiar with those. It was 3 different phases of studies that Aspen and Pitkin County actually took on themselves. We were a party to that, and that gets to the second part of the question, or the A part of the question. Really what we're there to do is provide technical assistance and guidance. And we tell sponsors how the agency is going to react to certain things that they're proposing. We say, hey, we don't feel good about this. We feel better about that. We weigh in as those options are being explored. So you kind of get a real-time view. The other important part is I represent the airports division of FAA. So I'm in charge of the airports district office. I don't represent flight standards. I don't represent air traffic. Air traffic is the gorilla in the room. I would be lucky to be a monkey next to that gorilla. They're just very big. So there will be certain questions that you'll ask that are air traffic related. I commit to you to taking those back and coordinating those with our air traffic folks and getting some answers to those. So they were a party to that as well. So they sat at the table with us. We all looked at options. We said, this is how air traffic feels. This is how the airports division feels. And we weighed in on that. So from that perspective, that just fast forwards to this process, right? So we were not involved in the visioning process. We were, I wouldn't say kept at bay, but we were kind of on the outside while that was going on. And I think part of that was a benefit to the community so they could actually voice everything that they wanted to get out on the table. Because you're going to hear from me a lot today that says, no, you can't do that kind of restriction. No, that's not allowed. No, and I'll have more explanation for that as we go. So are changes needed? Yes. I think what Aspen realized back in 2013 was aircraft are changing. So if you want to keep commercial service, that 95-foot wingspan restriction is not always going to be able to remain in place with some of the new aircraft coming online. And if you go back and review those studies, that's what all of them said. These are the typical aircraft that we see serving Aspen. So our role in that is to really provide advice and guidance and say, where are you at from a grant assurance perspective? Where are we from a partnering perspective on funding? And how do we move, as Brad said, maybe some of those views closer together? I will just tell you the agency's fairly rigid. I know that comes as a shock that federal government from a regulatory role is rigid, but there it is, I'll say it. So just be prepared for that as I answer these questions. Some of it is going to be, you're not going to like the answer. And we're going to be okay with that, and we're going to continue to have conversations.
All right. Could ASC or any commercial airport be run without the FAA? And I will run through all these bullet points. For example, is there an approach to privatization or localization whereby all non-safety decisions are made locally and not subject to FAA rules, but the FAA remains in control of safety-related decisions and the airport remains eligible for federal funding? B, under the FAA's Airport Investment Partnership Program, are there ways to retain past and future grant support while also increasing local control of noise, environmental, and safety rules, so long as those rules apply to all users and thus aren't unjustly discriminatory? Would such a program relieve the county of any grant assurance obligations other than those regarding use of the airport revenues and federal grant repayment? Additionally, would such a program allow the county to make its own decisions about what kind of aircraft could operate at ASC?
So a long question. So kind of the elephant in the room, the localization, I think people who had coined that phrase have kind of said that's a local Aspen thing. The agency doesn't recognize what is being called localization. It's just not something that we have in our vernacular. Privatization is, and it is really switched to Airport Investment Partnership Program. That's kind of the phrases that we use. Privatization is an opportunity. I'll tell you what it is and what it isn't. Privatization is an opportunity for a sponsor to take on a third party, and there's a couple ways they can do that. They can enter into an operating agreement, whereas that third party would operate the airport. All of the statutory requirements, all of the grant assurances would still apply to the sponsor, but they would have a third party running the airport, basically. So it's an opportunity for that. There is also an opportunity, as you dig a little bit deeper, and these are all of these types of programs have to be approved at our headquarters level. It's done through our compliance group. It's not something, it's very statutorily driven about what we can and can't do under this program. So the other option is you can actually find a third party that takes over everything. So we like to say, and it's a horrible way to phrase it, but I'm going to do it anyway. We like to say, when something goes wrong, who do we sue? That's really what we look at. When something goes wrong and something is happening with your grant assurances, who do we go after? There is a way under privatization, it's very limited, but there is a way to transfer those to a third party. But they are still required to adhere to all the same grant assurances that the county currently is today. So it's important to understand what privatization is, and what it isn't is a way around your grant assurances. Privatization does not afford you an opportunity to put noise restrictions in place. It does not afford you an opportunity to discriminate against certain types of aircraft or limit access to the airport. None of those things happen under privatization, and I don't foresee the agency changing that. And at this point, I can't comment for Congress, but right now we don't have the statutory authority to do that as an agency under privatization. So it's very controlled, very direct. And I think that answers potentially A and B, because the safety decisions are not necessarily made by the agency. They're made in partnership, right? We're saying, hey, this is the standard, and how are you going to meet that standard, or how are you going to provide an equivalent level of safety? But the general operation of the airport is also in control always of the sponsor, with the exception of restrictions. You can't restrict the airport. You can't say, well, we're going to limit growth to X. You can't say, we don't want this particular aircraft in, but we want this particular aircraft in. If they're in that same group, you can't unjustly discriminate against them. So I think that answers A and B. I think I answered C, no. It would not relieve you of your grant assurances entering into a privatization. It may relieve you, but depending on how that agreement is worded, it would then transfer over to the person you're transferring control of the facility over. So in actuality, you'd be removing yourself from the airport potentially, and your say in the airport, and it would be transferred to a third party under privatization. Additionally, would such a program allow the county to make its own decisions about what kinds of aircraft could operate at Aspen? No. within the context of, if it's let's say we're a group 3, right? So the modification to standard is one thing. The 95-foot wingspan restriction is a conversation we're going to have, I'm sure, today. When that's gone, it's gone. So anything that fits into that group 3 tier would be allowed to come into the airport. You can't discriminate against them. So I think that answers question 2.
Okay, let's go. Let's move on.
I like this. This is very...
ASC, ASC is a Group 3, ADG 3 airport with a number of modifications of standards, mods, 85 to be exact. The FAA requiring ASC to eliminate all modifications, is the FAA requiring ASC to eliminate all modifications to standards? A, when the FAA is considering modifications to standards and how it recognizes local constraints, could you please help us understand how it thinks about that choice? And B, does the FAA's consideration rely solely on private discussions with the sponsor or also assess diverse public sentiment? How does it learn of that sentiment?
I'll answer the second part first. This is a great example of how we learn of that sentiment, right? I mean, we do reach out throughout planning processes. We are involved in public meetings throughout the last environmental, throughout the last planning process. We were involved in all of those public meetings. So we had people there, we had staff there. We took comments from folks. We took written comments during the environmental process, and we will continue to do that. That won't change. So no, it's not a backroom deal where we're sitting there whispering to the county, you know, this is what we expect, and you have to go bear that brunt with the community. That's why I'm here today, is to kind of bear that brunt a little bit, take that shot. More than willing to do it. So that's how we gather through. We have a very open and public process when we go through any planning or environmental process. It's just how we're driven. NEPA forces us to do it. I mean, that is part of the law. It dictates that process to it, and we welcome that because it is important for us to understand. The part that might require a little bit of clarification for me is local constraints. So that means different things, right? So we've got geography constraints, obviously, at Aspen. And we've got river, highway, and a rather large mountain range all around. So we've got geographical constraints. If you're talking local constraints about access restrictions or things that locals would say, we don't want this in our community, we really don't consider those in we are, again, back to what I started with, standards, safety, access, those are the things that we frame everything we do around. So we hear those concerns, and if they're somehow able to meld into the project and they fit within the standards, the safety and the access piece, we absolutely take that into account. But we are a very standards-driven organization for good reason. For good reason. So, get them?
All right.
Would you be required to fix all 85? Not physically possible. So, I mean, there are just some things, like the runway slope is a great example. I think it comes up later in a question. You know, we'd have to build a 90-foot tall retaining wall right next to the highway and move part of one of the mountains into that to fill it, to get so no. But we're focused very heavily on certain things that really, really impact the operations here, like runway taxiway separation. So we do acknowledge there are going to be mods still in place after whatever program comes out of our efforts.
So it's the modifications of standards that are possible.
Yes, there are going to be some that will still be in place.
Okay. This kind of is about the next question too. Is the FAA's insistence on eliminating modifications to standards at ASC just for safety or for some other reason as well? And what are the advantages and disadvantages of such changes?
So back to the original, safety and access. And that, I mean, that really is the answer to that question. Absolutely. We are interested in safety first and foremost, but we are also interested in access to the facility. When federal funding is involved, that dictates that kind of fair and level playing field for access.
Do you want to comment a little bit on safety and access within the modifications of standards right now, and what needs to change there?
Sure. So I will tell you that I know of right now, and there's probably more, but that I know of as a precursor to my answer. Right now, I only know of 2 airports that have wingspan restrictions that are in place. It's Aspen and Haley, Idaho. I'm sure there are a couple more out there somewhere, but within that context, when the taxiway was moved from 221.5 feet to 320 feet, quite a bit of calculation was done about how did they come up with a 95-foot wingspan. And we have certain standards that we look at, certain calculations that we do when we look at a modification to standard. So what, at the time, the phrase that was used was equivalent level of safety. So what wingspan for 320 feet in group 3 would provide an equivalent level of safety at Aspen? And that answer came out to be 95 feet. So under that existing modification to standard, if you don't have aircraft that fit within that, so the wingspan is greater than 95 feet, and everything else has been retired, there are issues with your commercial service. And I think that was really what drove those 3 studies that Pitkin County sponsored back 2013, 2014 timeframe, was that concern. And that was what we were reacting to as well. We were also, the county was reacting to our comments about, we don't think we're going to consider a mod for 320 feet on the west side. We think we're going to push you to figure out a way to make 400 feet work, so we can start to work on that access and removing those mods to standards. And that in turn resulted in the conversation about air service and how, oh, wait a minute, how are we going to continue? What does our future look like at Aspen? So does that, am I getting to the meat of your question? I want to make sure
Yeah, we can get back to.
You'll know
If
when
it
I'm trying
answers
to dodge a
everyone's questions
question. I'll
later.
make it pretty clear. I'll make it pretty clear that I am trying to dodge your question.
Okay. From a safety, service, and funding standpoint, what would happen if ASC chooses not to address the modifications to standards needed to meet all ADG3 requirements? You already spoke to that a little bit. If the airport does not address the runway taxiway separation tied to the 95-foot wingspan limit and 100,000-pound landing weight limit, what would the FAA do? Would the FAA refuse further funding for airport operations and capital improvements? What circumstances might cause ASC to lose FAA funding, and what could be the financial and operational implications? Would the FAA demand or take legal action to recover grant monies paid to the county over the years? If so, how far back would the FAA go?
So there's a lot to unwind in that question, right? There's a lot going on there. So I would start with the 100,000-pound landed weight restriction. We technically don't recognize that. It's kind of an oddity in our world. Landing weight isn't typically how those things are looked at. It's typically max takeoff weight. That's a placarded item that we know for aircraft. They have a set certified maximum takeoff weight. We don't really look at that. Where part of that comes from the agency's perspective, is that's what the pavement is designed to right now. So what is hard for some communities to understand is the pavement can take more than that, right? From an engineering standpoint, you can have operations at 120, 130,000 pound aircraft. You just can't have them regularly, because you then start to deteriorate the pavement in a way that isn't acceptable from a maintenance standpoint for the county or for the agency. So it's a little bit of a misnomer, because we do have weight limits, but they can be exceeded. The airport has to be on top of how often, how much frequency are they getting in those heavier aircraft. So that's the first thing to kind of unravel with the question. So if we now know, right, through extensive work, I mean, we spent several years going through options. There were 17 at one point that we sat down with Pitkin County, all driven by the county. I want to make sure that is clear. All those options were driven by the county and what the county saw as the need for the airport. And we were weighing in with them on those options about, you can't do a midfield crossing here. You can't do this. That's not safe. And we had our air traffic folks making those calls. You can't limit this. We want to see full standards on this. So we were weighing in on certain things in that process. So we now know it's possible to meet the runway taxiway separation at Aspen. Whether that be shifting the runway to the west or shifting the taxiway to the east, it can be done. So would we remove all funding? The answer to that is no, we wouldn't. There's different pots of money that we deal with, and to make it just explain it as simply as possible, you have what's called an entitlement. Because of the number of passengers that you enplane and the way the airport operates, Congress has a formula that says Aspen will get X numbers of dollars, and those are entitlement dollars. And it's exactly like it sounds. It's an entitlement. The only way for the agency to take away entitlement dollars is for us or an outside party to file what's called a Part 16. It's a regulatory process where somebody complains that the airport isn't living up to their statutory requirements under the grant assurances. And we put that through a process. If the sponsor it's true and the sponsor is found in noncompliance and chooses not to bring themselves back into compliance, based on what we call a director's determination under that, if you're found in noncompliance, we can then take your entitlement dollars away. What we wouldn't do if you choose not to move forward and meet standards, we wouldn't provide discretionary funding. And that is exactly what it sounds like. It's at our discretion. It's at the secretary's discretion where those funds go. And that's a large amount of what it takes to actually do some of the bigger programs like we're talking about at Aspen. I think typically, I want to say we're about 2.3 million roughly in entitlements a year. And so that you can see how far that gets you at an airport. You understand that anymore, that's like a connector taxiway rehab, which is horrible in my perspective, but we can talk about that later. So would you lose all your funding? No, but you would be put in a category where we wouldn't be looking at spending discretionary money at Aspen until we could work together to come to some conclusions about how we were going to meet those standards. And I think that kind of answers part 2. Part 3, would the FAA demand or take legal action to recover grant monies paid to the county over the years? If so, how far back would we go? Quite honestly, I always refer to this as the nuclear option. It's not what we're in the business of doing. We are in the business of developing airports to standard and providing access. It does us no good from an agency perspective to try and claw back funds that have already been spent. Can we? Absolutely. Is it statutorily allowed? Absolutely. Does it happen in some cases? It does. But it is the last resort. It is when we have met 1,000 times and we can't come to any conclusions and we're just at loggerheads and we're kind of forced into that from a legal process. And that would be that Part 16 process. That would be an extension of that from a corrective action plan. And just so we're clear, that is the agency's administrative process. After that, the director's decision can be appealed through an administrative process internally to FAA and DOT. And then outside, once that's done, administrative law judge hears and makes a ruling, either upholding or overturning. And then it can go to the U.S. Court of Appeals, and then obviously U.S. Supreme Court if they choose to hear it. So there's more than just the agency saying this is how it's going to happen, this is what's going to happen. You are afforded due process before any of that happens.
Okay, that's not going to be my problem because I won't be here then. Okay, can ASE increase runway taxiway separation and keep the current 95-foot wingspan limit and 100-foot runway width, and why? Does ASE have to widen the runway to 150 feet if the critical aircraft we're designing the airport for is less than 150,000 pounds? Why do we have to give up the current 1,000 pounds landing weight? You already addressed that, so we can kind of eliminate that one. Could ASE maintain the existing 320-foot 100-foot runway taxiway separation. Could the 100-foot wide runway meet ADG3 standards without modification? If not, what studies support the change from 100 feet to 150 feet?
Again, so I think we've answered some of this. So the answer to actual question 6 is no. So if you increase the taxiway to runway separation, the 95-foot limitation goes away. It's not needed, right? It was put in place because the taxiway was too close. It would be removed. We've actually been asked by staff, I wish I had $1 for every time they asked. They're very persistent. I'll just tell you that. We've been asked, can we go to 365 feet and then get another mod to limit to this aircraft size? No. The answer to that is no. We know you can go to 400 feet. We expect you to go to 400 feet. But we do appreciate their persistence. Because every time we go back and we rehash all the data and we rehash all the work. So we very much appreciate them continuing to ask that question. And I would imagine even after this, we will be asked that question again. So the critical aircraft, you really have to think of it about almost as a fleet mix. And this is something that Brad alluded to a little bit, because we have some differences in what that looks like. So from an agency perspective, again, what we're worried about is if Aspen said, well, this is our critical aircraft, therefore we are at 100-foot separation. We are 100-foot width. We are eliminating a portion of the class group 3 that should be allowed to operate at that airport. So we actually believe, and the forecasts that Pitkin County has submitted in the past support our position, is that your critical aircraft is kind of a combination of aircraft, all group 3 category, but there are several that are in excess of 150,000 pounds. And those are previous documents that have been submitted to us that we have gone back and forth, just like we're going to go back and forth on this one, Brad, to establish before we approve them. And they showed aircraft serving Aspen greater than 150,000 pounds. So we would say, yes, you need to have a 150-foot wide runway. That is part of that conversation. Could Aspen maintain the 320-foot runway taxi? Yes, you can. But again, we then go into a kind of an entitlement-only situation. You also have to ask the question, what does that do to our air service over the long term? How do we handle the changes in aircraft? The airline industry is an interesting industry, and they don't often make changes based on one airport's decisions. They make it on a global scale and airports just kind of get, it is what it is. You know, the aircraft that they decide to buy drives where they're going to serve. So that is a question that you all have to ask yourselves from a planning perspective. How comfortable are you with that?
John, just quickly.
Yes, ma'am.
So are the 150-foot width and the 150,000 pounds conflated? They're tied together?
They are. So the way our advisory circular reads, and it's really quite confusing. We actually were confused when we went back and looked at the new revision, because it used to say if you're a group 3 airport with greater than 150,000 pounds, the runway width is 150 feet.
Jeez.
And then it had an asterisk at the bottom that said, if you're less than 150,000 pounds, you could be 100 foot. And what we did in the last change was we flipped those statements. So now it says, if you're less than 150,000 pounds, you can have 100-foot width. And then there's the asterisk, and it now says 150,000 pounds equals 150 foot.
Thank you.
So in answering D, yes, it can meet, but we most likely would not participate in a program that was forcing an access limitation. So if you're saying we are only going to build to 100 foot wide, you wouldn't need a modification to standard per se, but we probably would not be participating in that program from a financial perspective, just based on access.
Great, yeah, understood. Okay, will a reconfigured ADG-3 airfield allow bigger planes to operate at ASC? If so, are there mechanisms or conditions that the FAA would allow ASC to employ that would restrict the big aircraft so that we don't want at ASC? Is the FAA insisting on this redesign regardless, and what is the impetus?
So yes, if you go to 400-foot separation, you will see bigger aircraft at Aspen. The same with the 150-foot width. Yes. The answer to that is yes, you will. Is there anything that would allow you to restrict that? So again, we get back to like pavement strength. So there are going to be certain things that we design for, right? If we're designing for a 154,000-pound airplane, you're not going to want 200,000-pound airplanes coming in here, right? I mean, there are some balances to that. It's not necessarily a restriction. It is a engineering fact, right? You don't want to overload the pavement. So while it's not called out as a restriction, the pavement strength would limit the size of aircraft. We're also not designing for group 4, 5, or 6 aircraft. So you're not going to see a 777 coming into Aspen unless there's some dire emergency, and I would hope they would go to Eagle. So it's kind of a blurred answer, and I'm not trying to dodge the question. It's just kind of a blurred, there's a little bit of a blurred answer there. You don't need a mod, but we wouldn't participate, and yes, you're going to see bigger aircraft, and there's some natural breaks for where you're going to see a limit to the size of those aircraft that come in.
It sounds like we could design, though, to have a weight standard to some extent.
To some extent, but really the way we look at things today, it's not even based off of, like, we used to publish single wheel, dual wheel strengths in pounds. What is the PCR? So now it's like a PCR, another acronym, but it's a number, and then there's flexibility, and all of the dispatchers understand what the PCR is, what it means, what that limitation is for the aircraft that they can fly into that particular facility. And typically where that further protects Aspen is most of their insurance companies know what PCRs mean, and they're not going to allow them to have operations into an airport that really technically isn't designed for that type of aircraft use. So there's some other natural industry barriers that are provided that are just there. Aspen doesn't have to do anything. They just exist.
As you'll see, a lot of these questions are really about what we can do to kind of limit aircraft in here. Are there tools that the FAA would allow ASE to employ to limit private GA planes at ASE during peak times? Is there some way ASE could restrict GA landings, takeoffs that would be allowed by the FAA? For example, required or incentivized pilot training, safety certifications, slot reservation, and or peak pricing fee systems for landing and or airplane parking? And how would you recommend a petition to require or encourage additional pilot training safety certification for all GA pilots to be pursued, similar to those required for commercial pilots? Oh my gosh. Do commercial aircraft have any preference in sequencing, or does the FAA require that all planes be authorized to land first come, first serve, regardless of whether they are commercial or GA flights? And are there situations where commercial aircraft are significantly delayed from boarding and or taking off due to a rush of incoming or outgoing GA traffic? Does the FAA have any preference or differences in evaluation criteria between a privately run fixed base operator and a publicly run municipal county FBO?
So I told you I would be honest. I am going to dodge A through D. You did an excellent job reading those, by the way, but I'm going to dodge. So really a lot of those are flight standards driven, not airports driven. If you look at the word restriction, you know how I feel about it, right? I've been pretty clear so far about restrictions at airports. We don't like them. The agency doesn't like them. So I don't think that there is a mechanism in place that you could say, GA, you can't come in while we're pumping in our commercial flights. It's just not the way the NAS is run. It's not, and again, I'm straying a little bit from my expertise, so please bear with me a little bit, and I will coordinate these with our air traffic folks. But it's not, air traffic is not sitting out there saying, you're a commercial airplane and you're a GA, and you're a commercial and you're a GA. They're saying, you're a plane and you're a plane and you're a plane and you're a plane. And I know, because of the kind of plane you are, how far I need to have you separated. And so they're not going to get in the business of saying, oh, you need to go spin out over Kansas while we clear all these commercial flights. It's just not the way they operate. I will verify that and get it back to you in writing. But that would be my take on that particular part of the question. The rest, pilot training, those things are all covered by our flight standards folks, and they have specific rules on, and typically, I think you're going to hear from them, no, you can't require more to come into Aspen than we are the experts in safety. We've determined what it takes to fly an aircraft. Therefore, this pilot has his pilot's certificate and can fly in the NAS, National Airspace System. So on to E. So I will get back to you on those with confirmation. The FAA does not have a preference one way or the other of whether a fixed base operator is operated by the sponsor or by a private entity. We don't have a position on that. We see it both ways.
So I'm just going to ask, because this is a really important question to our community. I'm just going to, so we do say, are there tools? And you're going to let us know who else we can kind of take this question to. And then the second part of my clarification there is, commercial pilots have to have some certain kind of training. So we do want to know if private pilots, if there is, something else we can do to get more training, because most of our accidents here are on the GA side.
So
all of them. I'm sorry, all of them. Thank you.
I'll take that back, and we can ask those questions. But from a restriction standpoint, like when you start to talk restriction, the answer from the agency is going to be no. I mean, from a pilot training, I'll get with the FSDO folks and we'll figure out what that answer is.
Okay, great. So, is there currently an operational maximum landing takeoff level of activity at ASE? If so, what is the limit based on, and can it change during a day of operations? What is the LTO limit in perfect weather? How many times has the ASE reached that level? What happens when the FAA sees activity approaching that limit? With the coming of new technologies, avionics, can the current limit be increased, and if so, by how much? Does the FBO have any inputs as to the setting of the landing takeoff limits?
So again, I'm going to dodge this one. Again, this is an air traffic flow rate question, is what you'll hear it called, is the flow rate in and out of Aspen. That flow rate is largely dictated by weather and impacted by weather. They will have specific numbers for you. They'll know, the tower folks will know, on a good day we can do X number in throughput, we can do that, so they'll have that flow rate for you. So I will go back to them and ask on that. As far as does the FBO have any input into that? Typically, in a roundabout way, yes. I mean, there's only so much ramp space. So at a certain point, they declare kind of no joy. We have no more parking, but we've got 3 spaces for drop and goes. Here's where you can land, drop your folks off, and then you need to come back and pick them up at a later date. So while it's not a direct say with the agency, it is how do you fit those puzzle pieces, any more puzzle pieces together? I mean, we've all seen pictures of the ramp on holiday weekends where I'm amazed at how you fit so many multi-million-dollar aircraft in together as a puzzle. And how did you know that the guy at the very back wasn't leaving for 2 weeks? I mean, and they have a way, they coordinate all of that. They're very good at what they do. They know. But it's a kind of a roundabout influence. There's only so many places to park. And when those places are full, they're going to have to do drop and goes. And they do, I believe, and I'm speaking a little bit again out of turn, but I believe they do make places for drop and goes so they can assure that those people are still getting in and out. So, but I will take the other two back.
Okay. What, if anything, is the FAA doing to modify current airport design and safety requirements in anticipation of future changes to aircraft design? Does the FAA anticipate that the next generation of cleaner and quieter aircraft will have wider wingspans and require a greater distance between runway and taxiway center lines?
So I had to do a little bit of research on this one. We do have a current study. It's called centerline wandering, and it's a thing. So what they're tracking through our research center in Atlantic City is how far off of centerline are certain aircraft straying from when they're on approach. Like, what does that spread look like? Typically, that impacts runway width and then runway taxiway separation. For some of the newer aircraft and some of the newer technologies that are out there, they are looking at potential. There's potential. They are examining the opportunity to reduce runway width. But right now, as we understand it, that is only for Group 6 aircraft. So Group 6 aircraft require a 200-foot wide runway, and they're looking at can they fit within a 150-foot wide window. So the agency is doing research in those regards. They are looking at new equipment and the impacts on the NAS. But it's more from the technology that is evolving is keeping things closer to centerline versus further away from centerline, which wouldn't necessarily drive an increase in runway taxiway separation standards, if that makes sense. So I think you're probably, the agency is looking at it from a different viewpoint. Is there an opportunity that we don't maybe need as much pavement as we have at certain airports?
Great. Can an airport forecast and plan for a critical aircraft that is not currently in production and or certified? Would the FAA approve an airport layout plan for ASC based on the critical aircraft being one that is not currently in production and or certified? How can the airport layout plan process prudently manage uncertainties and adapt to changing airside technology?
So, I mean, the B is like a hugely open-ended question. Like, there's tons of things to look at in the market right now of how new entrants into the market are coming in, right? I mean, there's all sorts of things that remind me of the Jetsons. So, I mean, that is driving local decisions, right, of how you look at that, and what adaptations you might want to make, whether that's charging stations for electric aircraft. Those are a thing, and they're real, and nobody wants to buy a 17,000 mile long extension cord. So you're going to have a charging station where they're charging, but that's largely going to be local decisions, local conversations about emerging markets, and you work with planning staff that you've hired to have some of those conversations with. As to the critical aircraft not being in production, the agency would not examine that at this moment. We just can't. We can't plan for something that we don't know whether or not it's going to be certified or in production. We see a lot, right, from an agency perspective and an industry perspective of aircraft that are proposed that never quite make it to market. And if you were to select a critical aircraft, and again, we're really more focusing on a family of aircraft versus a single aircraft. We're really looking at that broader perspective. So we would say no, and we have in the past allowed them to be included in some of the forecasting models. The only time we're really comfortable with that is if we know, like, the aircraft is a real aircraft. It's a manufacturer that is a known manufacturer, and they are very, very far down the pipeline, and then they could be factored in at some point in the forecasting. And that makes it really tough on people like Brad when he's trying to figure out, well, how far down the pipeline are they? How much is the FAA going to accept? What is the FAA not going to accept? And those are all conversations that we have throughout the planning process.
Are there any different standards for higher altitude where we are, or our particular circumstances?
There are. So there are things like back to the runway taxiway separation issue that we hold so near and dear to our hearts. With elevation, we actually increase the distance that we hold aircraft. So you'll see lines across the taxiways, and that's where an aircraft stops. It's like a stop sign for an airplane. We move those further out from the runway based on elevation. So there are some things. We've had some standards that have come and gone as far as that goes, but really that's an object-free zone standard, and it's really trying to make sure that we are telling pilots when you're on approach to this runway, there's not going to be anything in this area when you're on the runway environment in case we have a runway excursion. That we're guaranteeing them this area is kept clear of aircraft. So yes, there are some that are based on elevation, and you do have some of those here currently.
Can the safety improvements program at the ASC be phased over time to minimize impacts, starting with the terminal redevelopment in advance of airside updates? If so, what assurances, if any, will the FAA require regarding completion of the airside improvements and removal of modification standards? If not, what flexibility would the FAA agree to on construction phasing airside versus landside? And what assurances would the FAA require in that regard?
So again, this is kind of one of those, does your mom know you're ugly questions? There's no right answer. So can the safety improvement program at Aspen be phased over time to minimize impacts? The answer to that is yes. It can be phased. We have been very clear repeatedly to the point of where I'm sure John and Dan are now sick of me saying it. We will not start on the terminal before the taxiway project starts. We're a little gun shy. I don't mind telling you. I'm pretty candid with my comments. We've been through this process before with Aspen, and we got to a point where we were all the way through the environmental process. And I will remind everybody that was driven by Pitkin County, not the FAA. The preferred alternatives, the environmental is our document. We sign it, but that environmental was formulated based on a consultant hired by Pitkin County, and so we are a little gun shy. I don't mind telling you, I would not be doing my job if I allowed for the terminal work to go first, because I have a fear. This body changes, the airport advisory board changes, and then we've got a brand new terminal that we've invested millions of dollars in, and we have no way to make sure that the safety-driven projects are done that are so important to the agency. Could they be phased? They could. Is there an opportunity to do some of it at the same time? Absolutely. I think you're going to have to, especially when you talk about moving the taxiway and some of the impacts it's going to have on the existing terminal. Those are all engineering things that will work out in a phasing plan and process, and that will be done based on funding availability, minimizing shutdown. I mean, that's very important to the agency as well. I mean, the last thing we want to do is see prolonged shutdowns at any of our airports. That is not the business we're in. So we would absolutely work with the sponsor to minimize those.
Can you just say a little bit more about, so could we do the terminal first with the assurance that we are going to follow through on the other stuff?
I have no way to hold you accountable. I mean, there is no statutory way for me to hold the county accountable to that I know of.
So that's a no.
If you've got one, I'd love to hear it.
So that's a no,
From my perspective today, yes.
just to be sure. Okay.
If somebody comes out and says, John, look, the agency has the statutory authority to do this when you give them a terminal grant, and it will obligate future boards of county commissioners to do this work, which I think you all might struggle with. We would obviously be willing to have that conversation, but from today's perspective and what I understand about our statutory abilities, the answer would be no.
What can ASC do to address the noise concerns and complaints of county residents? What can the FAA do to address those concerns? Would the FAA object to ASC implementing an enforceable noise abatement program similar to the programs at airports such as, I don't know, LGB,
Long Beach.
Long Beach,
John Wayne, Santa Monica.
Long Beach, John Wayne, and Santa Monica. Would it be permissible for ASC to enact any enforceable noise program without going through a 14 CFR Part 161 process? You can tell us what that 14 CFR Part 161 process is. Would the FAA be willing to work with the county on an airport noise compatibility program pursuant to 14 CFR Part 150 and to provide funding for it?
So I'll start with the easy one first. D, yes. Your airport, you're eligible as the county to apply for a Part 150 study. What that does is ascertain where noise sensitive areas are and allows you to put in mitigation measures to eliminate those. But we have a set decibel level. The agency, currently all the federal government, has a set decibel level under which that mitigation can occur at. So if you're not seeing those levels, then there's really not a mitigation that would be eligible. But yes, can we fund a Part 150 study? Absolutely. And a Part 150 study is a precursor to a Part 161. So in extreme cases where we identify huge impacts over what the agency has established as our baseline, sponsors can submit a 161 mitigation strategy, which basically says we want to do exactly what the first parts of the question asked about: enforceable noise restriction programs. Those have actually, if you go back and look at history, I think it was 1993, Congress passed the Airport Noise and Capacity Act, which limited those things. Aspen's curfew is a great example. It was in before ANCA, and the agency tried desperately to do away with it before ANCA passed. It's grandfathered, so therefore it is a restriction that was grandfathered before ANCA, Airport Noise and Capacity Act. No, you can't put an enforceable noise abatement procedure in place at Aspen. The other problem you have is the flight corridor is very narrow, right? In and out of Aspen, it's very narrow. So when you start to look at noise mitigation programs, you then start to look at restrictions as far as operating times, because there are not a lot of options for how you fly in and out of Aspen from an air traffic perspective. It's pretty fixed. At other communities, what they say is, climb out at this rate, go this direction, try and stay above this, and they're all voluntary. As soon as you add the word enforceable, it then becomes a violation of the Airport Noise and Capacity Act. So that would require you to go through first a Part 150, then a Part 161. You would propose the restriction, and the agency would basically rule whether or not that restriction was valid and whether or not it could move forward. So most of those places, and I don't recall, Santa Monica might be an outlier in that, were most likely, so I'll caveat it with that, most likely pre-ANCA.
They were all pre-ANCA.
They were all pre-ANCA. So, Congress told us this is no longer acceptable. We're losing the functionality of the national airspace system, and therefore, no more restrictions of this type. Did I answer them all? I think I got them all.
This next one's a long one, so bear with me. What can ASC do to address environmental concerns of county residents regarding greenhouse gases and criteria pollutants? What can the FAA do to address those concerns? Does the FAA have a research program or applicable regulations on aviation-related air pollutants of human and environmental concern? Does the FAA have regulations or guidance in place regarding the infrastructure, reliability, and safety of the supply and delivery of renewable electricity and hydrogen fuel for emerging aircraft? If ASC proposes to impose a higher landing fee on the basis of an aircraft's landing weight for the purpose of raising airside funds for offsets of an aircraft's carbon emissions, what FAA rules and restrictions apply? If ASC proposes to impose a higher fuel flowage fee on conventional, not sustainable aviation fuel, Jet A sold to commercial and GA aircraft for the purpose of raising airside funds for offsets of an aircraft's carbon emissions, what FAA rules and restrictions apply? Yeah.
So are there programs? So I would just start off by saying the agency, like every other federal agency, is concerned with climate change and some of the things that we're seeing. The agency has various groups within the agency that are exploring alternatives. I am not part of any of those at this point. I am dealing with leaded fuels on a pretty regular basis at this point, which is not the most enviable task in the agency right now. But a lot of this, we don't have statutory authority. So let's jump down to some of these proposals on carbon emissions. Right now, the agency, we do not believe we have the statutory authority to allow an airport to do those types of incentives or offsets. We are actually looking into that further based on this question. It kind of perked a few people, and they're like, we don't have the statutory authority, but let us look into this a little bit because it's a little bit intriguing. So we do have people that are actually currently looking at that and reinforcing whether or not we have statutory provisions or if they are required. Again, our program is permissible, so everything that is written into our laws is what we can do, and if it's not what we can do, then we can't do it. So it's a permissible statute.
Would that have to be maybe changed through Congress?
It would be something that we don't have at an administration level. We don't have control over that. But we are looking into that and we will get back to you with a little bit further guidance if that position changes at all. We'll just say yes or no. We, reinforce our answer or change it. So right now, we don't believe we have the statutory authority to do any of these. We do have programs that are underway. We're looking at alternate fuels for a wide range of entrants and existing users into the NAS, one of which is the leaded fuels issue that we're examining currently.
So like incentive programs.
It's not like, so right now, like, we don't have an incentive program. So, and it wouldn't be ours, it would be an airport's, right? It would be completely voluntary right now if an airport did it. They couldn't unjustly discriminate against a certain user, and that would be where you would have fear, is if you said, I'm going to give this this aircraft an incentive to fly into Aspen, and then this one doesn't get it. The one who doesn't get it will most likely file a complaint based on unjust discrimination. And that's where we're saying we don't have the statutory authority to say it's not unjust discrimination at this point. So we'll go back and get some answers on that. But from the fuels, right now there's the Eagle program. There's some things that we are doing to get out and resolve some of the issues for like a leaded fuels issue, but not, I don't have a lot of experience with the rest of these, but I can get back to you with clearer answers on the hydrogen and some of the other things that they're exploring right now. Obviously, electric is huge, and we all know electricity, or think we do. Anyway.
Okay, here's kind of a new direction. In sum, from the FAA's perspective, is ASC any more dangerous than any other airport? If so, why? What safety elements at ASC are in place to address or mitigate any special dangers? What additional safety elements are needed or could be employed to increase safety at ASC? Does the FAA have safety concerns regarding ASC's head-to-head operation procedures, current wildlife hazard management plan, lack of an engineered material arrest system?
So this is actually easy. We don't compare airports to airports. We don't say, oh, you're more safe than this airport, or that airport's more safe than your airport. We look at everything based on standards, right? I mean, we look at standards and how they apply to Aspen, and how do we achieve the highest level of standards at Aspen. So we don't have like a comparison scale. We don't rate airports that way. We just don't. It's not how we view airports. We view airports. An airport is an airport. If you've seen one airport, you've seen one airport. They all have their own interesting dynamics, limitations, things that cause the need for modifications to standards. And that is what is in place currently at Aspen. We don't have full 400-foot separation. It can be handled by the wingspan restriction. It can also be handled operationally. It gets very complicated to do that from an air traffic perspective. clearing taxiways before somebody comes in, making sure there's nobody on the taxiway when somebody goes out with a larger wingspan. So there are things that can be done operationally versus a modification, and that's handled by air traffic, and they make those determinations. At your particular airport, that would be cumbersome at best, and it would cause some issues with the flow and how aircraft come in and out. I think we've beat safety to death, right? I mean, you've heard my position on the parallel taxiway. That first and foremost in our minds. There's going to be some other smaller modifications that we look at, and can we tackle those while we're doing this? Absolutely. Can we make them better? Absolutely. Are we going to do that? Absolutely. So those are all things that will come out during design processes. And if you look at that list of modifications, some of them are much more near and dear to our heart than others, and some are, like we talked before, just can't be fixed because of the natural gradient of that runway. So I think that checks a couple of those off. So the head-to-head operations, so we call it a wraparound approach. We prefer to call it the wraparound approach. That is, again, an air traffic question. I can tell you from an agency perspective, and knowing what I know about the agency, if we had safety concerns about it, it wouldn't be happening. It would stop, and then we would figure out an alternate. So, but I will verify with, I'll talk with the tower manager, I'll talk with some of the folks in our district for air traffic and just verify that. But I can tell you, if the agency had a safety concern with that, it would not be happening in the national airspace system.
So John, we often get, or we hear from a lot of people that ASE is a very dangerous airport, and you're saying you don't compare airports that way. So where does this come from? Can you tell us, if you have any idea, where these people are getting information about that we're the most dangerous airport? Because it doesn't seem like that really exists.
I think it's just more challenging for pilots. I mean, obviously you've talked a little bit about the training program for commercial pilots. SkyWest has a fairly extensive training program if you're going to fly into Aspen. There are challenges that exist at Aspen that don't exist at Denver. I mean, there's a mountain. There are things that Denver's out on the plains. There's no mountain. So I can't tell you what's driving people's conversation in that regard. I could only speculate. We don't view this as an unsafe airport. I mean, we do business with you every day, and that means that you're working with us on safety every day in and day out. And we all feel good about that. From the Wildlife Hazard Management Plan, I don't think we have any issues with it. I don't know. I mean, you have one. You're a Part 139 airport. You have one. I do know that one of our safety inspectors was approached by a bear when he was at the airport, which he thought it was somebody in a costume, so it tells you where he's from. But it wasn't. It was a bear. So we don't have any concerns with the Wildlife Hazard Plan. So EMAS, just for everybody's reference, engineered material arresting system. That's typically placed at the end of the runway. It's crushable concrete. So when a plane goes into it, it actually crushes and slows the aircraft down. We have those at places where we don't have standard safety area. We have standard safety area for Group 3 aircraft at Aspen. So we only employ that at places where it's physically impossible for us to get that, and we try and add that level, an additional level of safety to get what you have. So we wouldn't be adding it to a standard safety area. We have it at Telluride. It's the only place we have it in my district, and it's because we can't get that full distance because there's a cliff on both sides. So, cliff and a mountain. So, no, we have no concerns that you don't have EMAS here.
If the airside improvements required to meet all ADG 3 standards are not made, could that cause a loss of commercial air service at ASE, the FAA downgrading ASE to a ADG 2, so our only commercial air service would be small turboprops to Denver, having to repay past FAA grants, you already asked that, becoming ineligible for future FAA grants?
Already answered that. So it could, right? I mean, that's the whole point behind the air service studies that were done was what are the ramifications of staying at 320-foot separation. I can't predict airlines any better than anybody else. So I don't know what that could result in for Aspen. I just don't. I mean, it would be pure speculation on my part. But the industry is changing, right? The aircraft that are coming into this type of market are changing right now. And there are limited lifespans to aircraft, and then they move to other markets where they're used for different things, cargo, that type of thing. So as to B, the FAA doesn't downgrade, right? We don't say, well, Aspen, you're now a Group 2. That would happen through a planning cycle. That would happen through a recommendation by your planners, and with a lot of conversation with us about whether or not that happens or not. Obviously, we're an organization, again, we're interested in access. We're not interested in going backwards. If you were moved to a Group 2 aircraft, I mean, that is definitely going to change the aircraft that can serve your airport. And again, there's no telling what the airline industry does with that. If they continue to serve you or they don't. But, you know, that's a business model that they run, not us.
Is it true that the FAA will not fund the new passenger terminal at ASC without full ADG-3 airside compliance, i.e. wingspans up to 118 feet?
So I've answered this, but this is a little bit different spin. So I think it requires a little bit of clarity. Again, there are still going to be modifications to standards that are required under Group 3 for Aspen. We're most concerned about runway taxiway and a few others, but that's the big one that we're talking about. So I think I answered the other question of, no, we're not going to fund the terminal before the taxiway gets funded. But we fully expect Dan and John to ask again.
Yeah, no doubt.
My answer will be the same as it's been for the last 7 years.
Can ASC use fiscal instruments like fees and rebates to influence choices that affect air pollution and noise without unjustly discriminating between different aircraft types? We kind of went on this, but I guess we're gonna talk about this some more. That is, can't we let in all FAA qualified aircraft, but charge each for its specific impact on our community? How does the FAA regulatory philosophy consider differences between aircraft? Since peak pricing and two-part landing fees are allowed, wouldn't universally applied and rationally based impact fees also be allowed?
So again, that goes back to that. We don't have the statutory authority to say that that's not unjust discrimination at this point, but we are looking into that. And it's almost it's a different phrase of the way the previous question was asked, I think.
Does the FAA have projections about whether, how much, and how quickly commercial aviation might shift from hub and spoke to point route architectures, which might favor more but smaller planes rather than fewer but bigger ones?
This is actually the easiest question of the day. No, we have no idea.
Alrighty, that was easy. With due allowances for Aspen's thinner air, does the FAA think electric air taxis, such as those tested and often announced in New York, LA, Chicago, and abroad, might help connect ASC to airports like Rifle, Vail, and Denver without necessarily needing runways or even land downtown? How should we think about this emerging rooftop or mini veriport technologies as a potential way to relieve some airspace constraints?
So again, these are all emerging, right? These are all what we call new entrants into the national airspace system. So I can't predict for you how you should examine that. Are they coming? I believe they are. I mean, I think in some form we're going to see a different type of aircraft using the NAS with conventional aircraft. I don't think one goes away. I think it's augmentation, but I would say, again, that's a local planning, like how do you weigh that out in your planning documents? How do you look at that from and even an entrance into Aspen? You know, maybe I fly into Aspen in a conventional airplane and then I hop on a taxi to get downtown. I mean, nothing's impossible, right?
Jetsons.
You don't want to wait at the roundabout, so you just hop in your air taxi and you come in.
Absolutely.
First world problems.
Can I ask a good question?
Sure.
So that would mean that we would still have to rebuild the airport to meet the standard aircraft that are now flying, and then in addition, maybe have some vertical takeoff spaces.
Correct.
That's what you're saying.
Correct.
Thank you.
Because we don't believe one goes away, because the long haul aircraft are not going to be serviced, at least in the near term, by some of these emerging markets.
Okay, thanks.
Has Class C airspace been considered for ASC? And you're going to have to explain a little bit about what Class C airspace is.
Well, I'm going to have somebody explain now. This is really an air traffic question. Right now, you're under controlled airspace because you have an air traffic control tower. There used to be something called a TRACAB here, which is a terminal radar approach control facility, and it was actually located in with the tower. I think a lot of those functions have been moved down to the center, either the center or another TRACOM facility. I don't know the answer to this question. It's really an air traffic question. I don't know why we would go from a controlled airspace to an uncontrolled airspace, especially with considering some of the uniqueness of Aspen. But we will inquire and get back with you.
Okay, so we've zoomed through some of these questions, so we have we're doing really well.
I got plenty to fill in.
All right, great. Can the FAA explain why ASC is entitled to noise restrictions, air quality studies, and the possibility of a quote-unquote green future, while Rifle County Airport has no such measures in place?
So I'm kind of confused by the question. I don't really understand. I mean, if we've allowed noise restrictions, if they're referring to the curfew again, it's pre-ANCA. I don't really know what the question is asking, because we are not certainly in favor of noise restrictions, right? I think we've made that pretty clear at this point.
I don't know what it means either.
Okay.
It's related to the guy from Rifle that writes letters to the editor about the influences of Aspen Airport making their way down the
Okay, great. Thanks for that clarification, Val. Would the FAA consider moving the runway to the terminal side and flipping the terminal to the side on Owl Creek Road?
So I think that's actually been examined. The FAA is not driving those types of decisions. The county drives those decisions, and the FAA weighs in on standards. So those are all local driven county decisions, not FAA decisions. We would absolutely partner with you if you came to us and said, hey, we want to look at something that's out of the box. What do you think of this? And we would go through our normal process of analyzing what that looks like from a standards perspective.
Would the FAA consider diverting the bigger jets to Rifle if a shuttle was provided?
So again, if that's implying, could you restrict access to certain types of aircraft at Aspen and push them to Rifle? The answer is no. The agency we don't support restrictions of that manner. If that's something that naturally happens over time, and that's what's driven by the industry, the agency wouldn't have any say in it. If the county tried to restrict something in that regard, we would have something to say about it.
Would the FAA anticipate more drop and goes from ASC to refuel in Rifle if fuel at Rifle is less expensive? And would more operations at Rifle require changes to air traffic control?
You know, just a very broad question. I mean, if I inherit $1 million tomorrow, will I keep my job? I don't know. That's a good question. We don't foresee that type of thing. I mean, quite honestly, the people flying into Aspen are not worried about saving $2 or $3 a gallon on jet fuel. I mean, maybe some of the smaller folks are that are operating smaller aircraft, and most of those are going to do drop and goes anyway because they're going to have pilots. We have a lot of Aspen aircraft from folks here that come down and fly to Front Range. And then they shuttle over the airport and fly out at Denver. And then they come back, and then they come back up and pick up their folks. So there are a lot of things that drive drop and goes. I don't know about that specific example.
Okay, well, thanks, John, for getting through these 25 questions. And now we are going to move to, Francie, correct me if I'm wrong, questions from the BOCC and the Airport Advisory Board. What's that?
And you'll call up.
Yes. Kelly would like to start.
I'm sure I won't get to ask everything I'd like to, so, but if I get the chance, I appreciate your willingness and time. I am wondering if the current FAA reauthorization process that is happening in Congress would give us an opportunity to lobby for changes in the conditions under which we have to operate and design our airport. And specifically the topics I think our community would be interested in are, could we look for changes that would allow us to say our commercial operations are safer and therefore they should have priority in landing over our GA, which is the more problematic aspects of our safety considerations? Could we look to a refinement of how groups are classified and perhaps narrow the classifications or create more classifications of groups that would let us design our airport for a narrower Group 3 aircraft? Could this let us advocate for the implementation of carbon fees locally? And does this reauthorization process dip into how air traffic control manages the airspace?
So I manage a field office, and I would say, we are governed very heavily by the Hatch Act, which does not allow us to lobby one way or the other. Reauthorization is reauthorization, and Congress makes the decisions that Congress makes based on input that they receive from their constituents.
Would those things fall within the scope?
Honestly, I don't know.
Okay.
I apologize. It's
that's
something
okay.
that's just really outside. We basically we administer what Congress passes.
Right, and we've heard that you're restricted through legislation about what you can do, so perhaps we can change the source for our community. But thank you. And I have more questions if there's more time for after you go through people.
Auden? Yes. Go ahead and say your name, too.
Auden Schindler. Okay, so can you help me understand the difference between entitlement funding and discretionary funding in terms of volume and how that affects an airport? So you said about 2.3 million in discretionary funding annually. If that were to go away, how does that affect an airport, and how does that compare to what entitlement funding is?
So entitlement is the 2.3 million a year.
Okay.
And that is exactly what it sounds like, entitlement. The volume of discretionary varies depending on the program at hand, right? So we have various programs that are happening throughout the airspace system that we're responsible for. Just as background, I have 117 airports in our district, ranging from DIA and Salt Lake to Lyman and Rifle and smaller airports. So we get a set amount of what we call our planning ceiling for discretionary a year. Typically right around 70, 75, 80 million dollars typically. We're usually more successful than that in any given year. We try and make sure we have programs that are ready, that we can take money that other airports can't spend. So on the magnitude at Aspen, like for a program of this size, we would be seeking huge sums of discretionary money. If you were to rehab your runway again, there's large numbers associated with that. It's many, many years of $2.3 million, and those funds are only good for 4 years. So I'm glad they're here. So after that, they expire. So if they're not used, they expire. So we then convert those to discretionary money. But the discretionary pot is a large pot of money annually. Not to get too far into the weeds, but we actually, when you as a sponsor say, I'm not going to use my entitlement dollars this year, we actually take those money from you and we convert them to discretionary money and then send them back out into the system. So that pot grows throughout the year as airports decide they're not going to use their entitlement dollars. And then, so it's very small for entitlement from a perspective to an extremely large pot of money that we draw from.
Got it.
So if an airport gives up its entitlement funding, can they go higher on the list for discretionary funding? Does it work that way at all?
So no. So we have certain guidelines that say if you're putting in for discretionary money, you have to use your entitlement money on that project. But we have other mechanisms that Aspen has fully participated in the past where you've said, I'm not going to use my money. And instead of me only getting 1/9 of it back or 1/11 of it back in discretionary, we actually have you transfer to another airport. So like Colorado Springs, for instance, or Grand Junction, thank you. And then they reciprocate. And when the next year comes and you need your money plus, they transfer it back to you, so you've got that. So there's some things that we do from a program standpoint that really benefit that. But good question.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Howie, why don't we go with you?
Oh,
Say your
well-
name, please.
Howie Mallory. I'd like to go back to question 17, just to clarify. It's a double negative. Does that mean yes? In other words, would it be correct to say, yes, it is true the FAA will fund the new passenger terminal at Aspen, at ASE, without full ADG 3 airside compliance?
So there's going to be there's going to be modifications to standards that are still in place. But are we going to say, if you say we're going to keep 320-foot separation, you're going to be hard pressed to get a bunch of discretionary money for a terminal.
That's called blackmail, isn't it?
No, it's called business.
Called business.
It's called business.
Good business. What's magic about one wingspan of 118 feet?
That's the break point. Like you were alluding to, maybe that gets divided up further at some point. That's the break point that the agency currently recognizes as a Group 3 or under.
Okay.
Steve?
So at what point do you make that decision? At what point would, if we, back to the yes for it, at what point would you say, yes, we'll fund the terminal without full ADG airside compliance? I guess the key word is full.
Right. So again, we talked about this, right? I mean, not to split hairs, but if there are 85 modifications to standards, there are going to be some that can't be reconciled. But the one we're not willing to yield on, again, is the 320-foot separation.
Okay.
And I think maybe you can clarify that a little bit more, John, about because we kind of talked about if it's possible for us to eliminate a modification of standard, then we need to. Is that true?
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you.
And we've proved it's possible with like a bunch of different examples.
Steve.
Okay, I'm Steve Child, Commissioner. Thank you for being here. I have a list of questions. I'll just do one at a time. Given the number of private aircraft that run off of our runway at some point, landing or taking off, wouldn't a 150-foot wide runway be better from a safety standpoint, irregardless of the weight? Just to make a wider paved surface on the runway would prevent probably so many aircraft from running off of the runway.
More real estate is better, right? And a lot of the runoffs are happening to the side, right? I mean, we just saw that. More real estate is better.
And that, to me, would be a safety concern that the FAA should be concerned with.
Yeah, and again, we're examining things on a global, like a whole entire United States national airspace system when we're setting standards. We don't go to this is happening at this airport. What we say is, okay, how can we improve that, and how can we make that safer at that particular airport? So we're not going to have a specific standard for Aspen, but we're going to say, hey, this would enhance your safety.
Okay. Since we are contemplating the possibility of a west side taxiway, but there's really not room to put it for the entire length, would you consider a shorter taxiway that the aircraft would actually be taking off from the old takeoff place on the runway before the runway was extended?
So again, some of that's an air traffic conversation. We would push to have the taxiway go to the full end, and if not, we would need to develop some operational procedure for air traffic to handle that. And they would be the ones who would say, hey, this is from an operating standpoint, these are the concerns we have with that.
Okay, and I presume the same way with the runway crossing of aircraft would be an air traffic control thing that you don't have any control over that.
Well, we have some input. I mean, we've worked with them for a long time, and midfield crossings are like the last thing air traffic wants to see. So crossing air traffic. There are certain times that it's allowable and it can function well, but from a safety perspective, crossing at the midpoint of the runway is not ideal at all. So we really try and push, that's why we have full parallel taxiways. We really try and push them to the ends to cross. That's very, very important to the agency.
So are there airports where they have end of the runway crossing points?
We have end of the runway crossing points, absolutely.
And that would be a much safer thing than a midway crossing point?
Yeah, and that's really what we strive for. If you look at most of the big systems of runway taxiways, we really strive to bring people into the ends at all times.
Okay.
There are circumstances where we just don't have it, but it is ideal to bring them in at the end.
Okay, Steve, let me take a question. Valerie, did
Okay.
you want to?
No, I got it answered.
Okay.
We have, online.
Okay, is it from one of the Board of County Commissioners or the?
It's Mike.
Okay. Go ahead with the,
Yeah, I do have more, but if you
okay,
can
we'll come back,
to me,
because
that's
Kelly
all
has
right.
more too, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so Mike Solence, I can't see the
Thanks,
question.
Mike.
Does somebody else want to read that?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Mr. Bauer, the community, you've heard anecdotally and through our common ground recommendations that they're very concerned about larger aircraft coming into Aspen. And I heard in your responses, you remarked that more than likely the 777, for example, would not come and land at Aspen. Do you have any comments, performance or otherwise, whether the mid-size like 737, 7-900 series or the mid-size Airbuses, do you have any comment as to whether or not, as a practical matter, they would operate into ASC?
We don't know at this point. I mean, it takes a lot, right, for an airline to run some of those simulations and understand the performance capabilities of their aircraft into a specific site. And until that 95-foot wingspan restriction, they're most likely not going to be spending a lot of capital on that until they know they could operate there. We had a lot of meetings during the last round of planning with Bombardier at the time. And that was their C series aircraft, 100 and 300, which are now Airbus A220, 100 and 300s. And they have said those two aircrafts are very capable of serving Aspen.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I'm going to go back to Kelly.
Okay, I wondered if related, I think the bombshell that we heard today was the interest in the FAA to co-plan the construction of the terminal and the airside improvements, which is not how we crafted our visioning goals and not associated with the resolution that the board adopted. So I'm wondering if there is a strategy, because what we're trying to do is leave space to better plan for future conditions as they become, information about them becomes more available, while also, achieving our community's interest and really consensus related to the terminal and transportation type of improvements. So would the FAA consider some types of strategies, maybe a completion bond or something like that, to give assurance, or whatever other tools exist out there that would create assurances for the FAA while also allowing us to proceed along the timeline that our community has supported? Or the phasing that the community has supported, I should say.
So, I mean, I think it would be a heavy lift for us. I mean, am I ruling it out? No, and I think I didn't rule it out if I said if there's some mechanism that's out there that we can talk about that I'm not currently familiar with, I think we would be open to talking about it. But again, we do have some misgivings. I mean, there is a bit of a trust issue. Because we had gotten to that 11th hour before, again, fully based on county recommendations and county preferred alternatives, and then it was kind of like the Charlie Brown football move. So, I mean, are we willing to have that conversation? I think we are, but it would have to be ironclad. Our legal staff would have to review it all,
Sure.
see if we even, again, the permissible part of our statute, is it something we could even do under our current regulatory environment?
Okay. I appreciate that openness. Thank you. And I have more.
Steve?
Okay, looking at the air traffic control tower, which is short, they can't see the end of the runway. To me, that's potentially a safety issue that they can't actually see to the end. But I'm wondering about is the tower that we have and the equipment that's in it, is it becoming obsolete, or could it be upgraded in the place it sits? Or do we need a new air traffic control tower that would be taller and more brought up to speed, in which case we could build it anywhere and not on that existing location?
So, wonderful question. So I'll delve a little bit into eligibility, because it's important to kind of separate a few things. So what you have is a FAA-owned, FAA staff tower.
Mm-hmm.
Oddly enough, under our program, we can't fund that. If it was sponsor-owned, FAA staffed, we could fund it. So we give grants to sponsors. We have some things we need to watch out for as far as commingling funds, so they don't like us augmenting another part of the agency's budget. That's what it's called. It's actually forbidden by law. But in this particular case, with the option that you've selected, the tower has to move. The tower can't remain there and get full 400-foot separation. So we have some certain eligibility allowances that say if we are impacting a facility that is normally not eligible for our funding, it may, and I use that word and emphasize, may be eligible for AIP funding. And at that point, yes. So right now you have a camera at the end, cameras at the end of the runway. That's largely due to that viewing angle from the tower. You're actually looking up at the end of the runway, which when you drive down the highway and you look, you're like, really? Is it really? It's a very big distortion. I actually got to go to AFTEL, which is a modeling center where they modeled the Aspen airport, and you could stand in that tower in this room and they would project it all out. So the cameras would go away at that point, because you would build a tower that then met that viewing angle standard. You would bring all the equipment up to standard. So there are options there. We would work pretty heavily with our air traffic folks on, is there any way they could fund it? There are options. I will tell you, it's a low return on your investment, but if you took over ownership of the tower, then there is no doubt that it's fundable under our program. And I'm not encouraging you one way or the other, I'm just giving you options.
Can I just tag on to Steve's question?
Yes, Patty.
Thank you. So if we were to move the tower, would that be considered part of the phasing of the airside, landside?
It would.
Thank you.
Okay, I have one more question, if I could ask that now, and then
Yep.
I'd be done for now. I presume that there's a lot more modern or like up-to-date, state-of-the-art navigation equipment that we don't necessarily have installed at this airport. And I'm curious if that, I mean, I think that would make the airport safer if we had the most recent state-of-the-art navigation equipment, and then if the incoming aircraft also had the right equipment on board to communicate with and utilize that sort of navigation equipment. And I actually see this as a way that maybe in more inclement weather, when there's not as good a visibility, the planes probably could still land if they had the right equipment and if the airport had the right equipment. So could you speak to that issue?
Sure. So that world is always evolving. Technology is always evolving. We are a little slower than most to evolve, which should be expected from a safety-driven organization. We take a lot of time to look at those types of things. Largely, we'll be examining all sorts of options in the airport layout plan, master planning process to say, is there anything we can do to improve what we call minimums? So you make their decision heights when you're coming in on an approach. If you're at a certain height, you have to decide at that point, can I see the runway? If I can't see the runway, I have to fly the missed approach and I have to leave and come back. So we would be examining most of those options and see if there's any improvement. I would say, again, Aspen is fairly unique in some of the setups that are here, like a localizer with a DME on top of a mountain. It's not typically where you see a localizer. It's typically where your other localizer is, which is at the end of the runway. So there are some things out there. And just for everybody's reference, a localizer provides you with a horizontal guidance into the runway. So get you closer to center line by a defined signal that the aircraft receives. So yes, we're going to look at every option we can. And if there's something out there that improves things, we will absolutely be amenable to taking a look at that. But then you factor in yet another group of the FAA, which is our engineering services and technical operations folks who own and manage a lot of those things.
So to tag on to that, would there be some aircraft that could land and others would not be able to land because they didn't have the right equipment on board?
Sure.
And maybe that's the case even now, that sometimes there are aircraft that they just can't come here, whereas maybe all the commercial ones can come in, or some private aircraft would be able to come in.
It's probably not a yes or no. They may be able to come in certain visual flight rule conditions, VFR, without any equipment necessary. You know, we've got a MOUS rail and reels, runway end indicator lights now that were installed under an AIP project a couple years ago, 2-3 years ago, that are visual nav aids that allow those people to operate under visual flight rules. So it's not a whether they could come in or not, it's a when can they come in and when can they not. And it is a matter of the equipment that is contained within the aircraft. The better equipment, the better precision they can have. They have more options as far as their decision heights get lower. Some of those things change, so yes.
I'm just going to say something that makes this clear, because I recently had a situation where someone at United said that they could not land, and I know that private planes were landing, and they were saying that some of their older planes that are coming in here didn't have the right equipment. Can you verify that?
I can't. I don't know what equipment SkyWest has, but I mean, if you're hearing it from the airlines,
that is a concern. A lot of people are like, why can't I land as a commercial, but these other planes are? And I think that addresses exactly what you're saying.
It's an equipment issue.
Can I ask a more detailed question on this real quick? Just
Yes.
Can we require or incentivize that equipment to be on board an aircraft? Can you require or incentivize, or let us require or incentivize?
No. So like incentivize, if you were to say anybody who wants this equipment, Aspen's willing to buy it for you. I guess you could do that, but you can't use airport revenue for that. But there may be opportunities. I don't know from an incentive. Again, it's a permissive statute, and I don't think the agency has really looked at. We have things like We have guidance on new service to an airport and incentivizing that. And what does that look like? We have statutory authority to say this works and this doesn't. So we would have to probably work out some of those details. But yes, equipment in an aircraft will determine whether it can come in under certain conditions or whether it can't. And
I'm guessing that has to do with safety and access.
well, as we talk about, yes, it does. And as we talk about like the C series, what we refer to as the C series, or the A220, 100, and 300, those are brand new aircraft with state of the art. I mean, they have options, right? It's like a car; you buy options with it, but they're state of the art aircraft. You know, and if I'm mentioning Airbus, I better mention Boeing. You know, so the 737 MAX is now in a certification phase. You know, they're going to have equipment packages that are conducive to approaches.
Wait. Bruce.
Yeah, I'm
Say-
Bruce
say your
Gordon.
name. Yeah.
I'm Bruce Gordon. I'm on the advisory board. Thanks for being under the gun here. Really great answers. It started off. I think you said that either the county initiated or the FAA initiated a fleet mix, and that's how this whole discussion started and got going. And so we're down to discretionary money and entitlement money and building the terminal, which is what the Vision Committee, I think, wanted to do first. So if we found another way to build the terminal, let's say with our own money, or the FBO is taken over by the county and we have some monies to do that, would there be discretionary money to be able to improve the runway, which I know has undergone some looking at needing repair in the near future? Is that money out the window also if we don't choose to deal with the taxiway and runway separation?
You'd be down to where we would say you need to find a way to maintain that with your entitlement dollars. So
The entitlement dollars, not discretionary.
we would really push you to the 400-foot separation. And back to your last question, I have no idea what equipment SkyWest has on its airplanes, just I have no clue.
Kelly.
Sorry, I was trying to let you know Sarah had a question. She had
Oh, okay. Sarah.
Thank you. I'm trying to make sure I follow order of operations here. From what I'm hearing from this conversation is we have a runway that's requiring significant annual maintenance at this point. And my understanding is that the only way it will be funded for rehabilitation, a true rehabilitation, is implementation of a new airport layout plan that includes these runway changes. Is that correct?
What we're saying is we're not going to provide discretionary funding for that at this point.
So 2.4, which doesn't, or 2.1 million, which I can testify gets nowhere in this town. Doesn't matter what the project is. Okay, so then my follow-up question to that is that the airport layout plan, we're still trying to hit November to submit that to the FAA through the approvals of the advisory board and the BOCC. And what kind of turnaround time is there typically in those reviews and negotiations, so to speak? I'm just trying to understand chronologically if those discretionary funds require the airside first, and then we need to flip to the landslide. Just wanting to make sure I'm spending my time on the part where I actually can make a difference for this community. And right now I'm struggling with that.
So, trying to think of the most direct way to answer the question. You know, the funding issue, so the turnaround on the ALP is we airspace it. So we put it through an airspace process. So we reach out to all the other lines of business within the agency and we say, what do you see from your interest level from a technical operations engineering services, that's nav aids or air traffic? We airspace that and say, we need your comments. You said the word negotiation. I'm not a good negotiator, if you can't tell. I'm more black and white. It's kind of this is the standard and we're not negotiating on the standard. I think these guys can attest to that attitude over the history of us all working together. I think if your runway is falling apart, it again furthers the need to make some critical decisions, because these decisions, you know, I will remind you, were made in 2018. And we had a path forward, and then we didn't. So, you know, from an agency perspective, we are doing what we can do to ensure that you have a viable facility, but there are requirements on the county to ensure it remains viable. And part of operating an airport is making sure that you're making those funding decisions in accordance with our standards. So it's a rock and a hard place, right? You are stuck between a rock and a hard place. The only solace I have for you is you have control over how hard that rock and the hard place is. I mean, if you came with an ALP that we looked at and said, we know exactly how this can be implemented, we believe you're going to implement it, and then we start to work on how does a runway rehab fit into the program. And do we look at that point of, is that the time to take it from 100 feet to 150 feet? What does that look like from a phasing standpoint? What does that look like from a funding standpoint? And we get into kind of the nuts and bolts of it. So you control all that. That's the beauty of it. You control that rock and a hard place. I'm just laying out the parameters for you that the agency looks at when we make those funding decisions. And we do. I mean, you're competing not only against 117 airports in my district, but we're 3 states, a part of 7 states. We're also 7 states and part of 50 states and territories. So all of that, how all of that plays together and how we're able to prioritize things on a national level, all plays into standards. They're asking us these questions. If I'm asking for $100 million in a given year for Aspen, I can guarantee you they're going to ask me, does the taxiway runway separation standards meet Group 3 compliance? They're going to ask me that question. And if I say no, I can tell you I'm probably not going to get that money. So, I mean, those are the things you find yourself in with these decisions.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Francie.
Okay, I just want to clarify something that probably a lot of people in this room don't need clarification on, but I do. So if we turned in an ALP, which included a 400-foot separation and a 150-foot runway, and it left the possibility of an FBO on the second FBO on the west side with an end of runway crossover, would that end of runway crossover be any impediment to getting approval? Not a midfield, but end of run. That's not an impediment at all. That's an okay thing. You could just do that.
Yeah, and even if you came back to us and said, we can't make this work. We're 500 feet short, we're 1,000 feet short, we can't make this work. We would airspace that with our air traffic folks. We'd actually have, we'd have a meeting, we'd have your folks down. We'd sit down with folks who handle that from the tower and who are air traffic specialists and say, what does this do to the flow? How do we need to model this? What do we need to understand about the complexity of introducing this operation from a safety standpoint? We'd hold a panel, they'd analyze it, and we may be able to look at options other
like a
than
midfield crossing.
Yeah, like a midfield, and get their feedback on that. I mean, that would be something we would examine. That's more of maybe where the negotiation is.
That's exactly what I was referring to.
Like where do you look at those nuances? And we've partnered with Aspen for as long as I've been with the agency, which is entirely, I had hair when I started.
Okay, great. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Jackie, you get a chance?
Yes, Barry.
Thank you.
Say your name, please.
I'm Barry Vaughn. I'm on the Airport Advisory Board. You mentioned looking at approaches, maybe approach reconfiguration or new approaches as part of the airport layout plan. Did I get that right? Or were you talking about equipment that would be associated with perhaps new approaches or reconfigured approaches? Is that part of the airport layout plan that's in process now, or is that something that would be an add-on later if requested?
I don't know what the airport's looked at this point as far as equipment or any changes to the approaches that we haven't had a lot of conversations. We've been kind of mired down in a certain subject, which I bet you could guess what it was. That's something you could present to us, and we would obviously, again, we'd coordinate with our Takeoff folks, we'd coordinate with air traffic. I was in a meeting for an entire day talking about some of the procedures into Aspen last week. And it was a room full of a lot of really smart people trying to figure out how to do things at Aspen. So all internal, all driven by current setups and current equipment. So there's always, that conversation's always going on in the background. We're not proposing any dramatic changes in anything at this point, but if there are options out there that we need to explore, we would look to the airport to provide that to us in a study.
That's very interesting to hear about that meeting that you had with a lot of really smart people looking at approaches, because one of the things that the BOCC has set up here is a safety task force that operates under the aegis of the Airport Advisory Board. And one of the things that the pilots, it consists of 12 local pilots, some of you whom fly very sophisticated equipment and use instrument approaches on a regular basis, is moving forward, engaging with our aviation partners to try to improve the approach situation here. So maybe at another time we could follow up with you on that, because we want to engage with the people at FAA who would be appropriate.
Is there a question, Barry?
Actually, there is. Okay.
Thanks.
Coming back to 7. Coming back to 7, there was some discussion when you were talking about 7, the reconfigured ADG airfield, allowing bigger planes to operate at Aspen. And I think this was put to you and answered, but I want to be absolutely clear on this. If you don't usually deal with maximum landing weight, you deal with maximum takeoff weight, maximum certificated takeoff weight. But if the county were to come up with a regulation, a restrictive regulation, saying we're not going to allow airplanes with maximum takeoff weights in excess of X operate here at this airfield, that would be viewed by the FAA as a no-no. That's a restriction that's unjustly discriminatory. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. With respect to, there was some discussion at 9 regarding maximum LTO landing takeoff level of activity at the airport. Now, there might be an operational flow rate limit that exists just because of constraints in terms of how many aircraft center can send to us and how many we can turn around and park on the ramp and the rest of it. But there's no regulatory limit. There's no number set by FAA or anyone else to your knowledge. Is that right?
Correct. Correct.
Okay.
It's a form of function, not a restriction.
Understood. One of the things that last question, thank you. One of the issues that the community is looking at here is the new FBO contract, and there's a competition underway right now, beauty contest, to see who's going to be the holder of the next FBO contract, if anyone, for the presently existing one FBO facility here at the airport. And some citizens have suggested that it would be great if the county didn't have an FBO operator, but the county operated the facility itself. And one of the benefits of that would be being able to take the profits earned by operating the FBO and using it for worthy causes outside the airport perimeter, using it in the community for good things for the community, but not aviation purposes. It's my understanding that that would not be allowed.
That's correct. It's revenue. It's called revenue diversion. There's statute that covers that. That airport revenue generated on the airport must be kept on the airport.
Thank you. Nothing further. Thank you.
Thank you. Auden.
You said the FAA is looking into things like incentives around carbon
Sorry, continue.
offsets, so forth. My question is, that's interesting. How long is that going to take?
So I don't know the specifics. What I said was there are groups within the agency that are looking at all of these things, like alternate fuels. They're looking at all of these things. I don't know specifically on carbon offsets if there is a specific group that is looking at that subject today.
And what about carbon taxes? If you taxed per passenger carbon, is that even on the radar?
So that's considered a head tax, which is not currently legal. The only legal head tax is a passenger facility charge, which there's a regulatory framework around. Not that I know of. But again, I have very limited knowledge in those areas, and we have an office that looks at those types of things within the agency.
Thanks.
Get a
Meg.
mic.
Meg Haynes, member of the Airport Advisory Board. Back to question number 3 with regard to modifications to standards. This may be a question that's held for future negotiations, but can you give us some examples of maybe possible future acceptable modifications to standards for us?
So we're going to try and take that list down, right? Our objective is when this program happens that we don't have 85, that we have 40. I don't know. I don't know what a realistic number is. Like the example I gave is the runway gradient. We have a certain standard for from one end to the other how steep it should be. And we're just not going to get there here. We're not. We're realistic about that. That mod is going to stay in place. Are we looking to add new modifications? The answer is no. We would not be looking to add any new modifications. Something might come up in the design process that we don't foresee today, where the consultants come to us and say, John, we've got the 400-foot separation, but this taxiway can't connect at a 90-degree angle. It's going to be off a little bit. Can we talk about a modification for that? Very much like the west side end may have to be, like I think it is today, on the east side of the south end of the taxiway. Those would be things that we would then look at from a design and safety perspective, again, coordinating with air traffic and talking with those folks. But we are looking to reduce the number of mods here, not looking for ways to add additional restrictions through modifications.
Thank you.
Greg.
Thank you. Greg Postman, Pitkin County Commissioner. Greg Postman, thank you. Thank you for being here. This has been very informative and sobering and heart-wrenching and all at the same time. The only thing that doesn't change are the mountains around us and the consequences of a large aircraft putting it in somewhere out away from the runway. And I think that's on the minds of everybody in the community. So when we talk bigger aircraft, of course, it creates a lot of concern. You know that. I do have a few quick questions. The first one is that on several occasions today you've mentioned that either you didn't have the authority or the expertise to speak on a certain subject, and I think we'd be interested in hearing more suggestions about, questions about climate. It'd be nice to know what the FAA actually is considering regarding what we consider an existential crisis, and just how seriously is FAA addressing it. We know things move very slowly at certain levels, but this is a crisis. And so I'm just wondering, on your list of people to hook us up with to consult, I'd like to see, and maybe some others would as well, can we get with the experts at air traffic control? Can we get with the engineering people? Can we get with the climate office? And also thinking noise and air quality. You've talked, and I'm pretty clear about how the FAA handles noise and air quality. But my one question was, have we exceeded those limits? Because for us, it's pretty bad. It's gotten worse. But have we actually exceeded limits that the FAA might place on noise or air quality? Because if you come and measure it and say, hey, this doesn't meet our limits, so we're not going to do anything. I'm just concerned about that. Do we have an understanding where those limits are and how close are we to them? So that's the first one. Thanks.
So I think we were looking actually for some noise contour maps from previous planning studies, which we weren't able to find before we came up. But that would be the biggest thing, is developing a noise contour map to see where the noise is. And I want to be clear, because a lot of people get confused about this. It's not your consultant going out and setting a microphone somewhere and taking a reading off that microphone. It's just much more complicated than that. It's a modeling. So we model noise. So we know the aircraft that are using the facility. We know proposed aircraft that might use the facility. We know what their decibel rates are. We look at in run-up, where do they run up at? What does that look like? And they model noise on the airport. So first and foremost, noise exposure is what is mitigatable under, say, a Part 150 study. Not necessarily air quality. So I just want to make sure that there's a distinction there. We typically wouldn't put like the Board of County Commissioners in touch with those people at FAA. We would be doing that with staff, folks at the county. We would all be together. So I'm hearing what AEE, our environment group, is saying. I'm hearing what air traffic is saying. I'm hearing what tech ops, the equipment people, are saying, and we're one FAA. So there's not a distinction.
Okay.
So we absolutely, we do that all the time throughout this process. That will happen, and has happened before. The equipage issue, I mean, it's really tough here because of the terrain and some of the complexities. So I don't know that you're going to be able to make huge improvements. I will say that the county did fund a study, an airspace study, probably 2014-15, that analyzed the county's preferred alternative at that point and what it was going to do to minimum, and were there any additional equipment requirements that could improve that from an efficiency standpoint, and that's available. I mean, we all have that. So there are some things that are still out there from a procedural perspective, but we will absolutely be putting folks in touch with all of those people. That's just part of the process that we go through as we're hashing all this out.
Great. So I assume, so it won't be coming to our board, but our board can direct our staff to be requesting more detail on what's happening at the climate office.
Right.
Or the other, if I could. You mentioned noise modeling. So the FAA, does it look at proximity to residential, commercial development adjacent to the airport? Like, we have a proposed development right across the street from the run-up area, as you probably know. And I know there are concerns about noise and air quality there, as well as elsewhere at the ABC and around. Is that part of your consideration when you're looking at our airport?
It is, but it should be more part of your consideration when you're looking at your airport, not us. Right? Where you're allowing things to go in and you're allowing developments to go in, are they compatible with your asset? And that's where we seem to be falling short in communicating that message to people, is you're responsible for allowing those developments to go in that then are going to call you nonstop and complain about airplane noise. And we have it all over the country. I mean, it's not just here, that's everywhere. I have great stories about it where people moved in and the first day they were calling lodging, and they were
complaining
right underneath the approach, a mile and a half off the end of the runway. And they just started complaining and saying the airport needs to be shut down. So a lot of those things, that's a county conversation.
Let's assume the city's listening in on this. Can we move to press?
Or city,
Okay.
sorry.
Yes.
I promise
Apologies.
I am.
Okay.
Clarification on one thing. The FBO obviously has a very lucrative fuel sales concession here, and it's a monopoly, as we know. If the county were to take that over, are you saying that it's, what was the term, very quickly, regarding airport revenues, we couldn't use those fuel sale revenues for purposes other than on airport?
Correct.
Okay, so that's a distinction between what a contractor can do versus what we can do with the money made at the airport.
Correct, because you're the sponsor and you are generating revenue for the airport. We would want you to offset what you're asking us for with those funds.
Great.
But there's much more flexibility. Like, you're able to actually fund things that we might not be able to get to from a priority standpoint at the airport. And that's called a proprietary exclusive, which is allows a sponsor to be the sole proprietor of an FBO on a field.
Thank you.
All right. If it's okay, can I take it to the press and we can maybe come back to Board of County Commissioner questions after? Okay. Is there anybody from the press that would like to ask some questions?
I'm gonna get in trouble.
Okay. Doesn't look like it. Oh, look at John just went. Whew. All right. Is there anybody from the? Oh, yes. Okay.
John can't ask questions.
John Peacock.
Do I have any veto say? Do I have a veto say?
Thank you, Jackie. And John, thank you for being there. Sorry I'm not in the room with you today. I always enjoy our conversations and asking you the same questions in different ways to try and get us moved along. But just for clarity for our community and our advisory board members, you've said a number of times that we cannot unjustly discriminate against aircraft and access, and that implies that there are some standards for just discrimination. Could you give some examples of how the agency would allow and under what circumstances the agency does allow? Yeah, I believe it's safety related, but I'd just like to make that transparent for the community.
You're always good at putting me on the spot, John, so I appreciate that. You haven't failed. I can't think of a good example. There are times where an airport will decide to treat a class of user differently. I guess one good example is incentive programs for new service. So if I'm an airline and I want to come into your airport and offer a new service to a new city, you can incentivize me. But you're not going to incentivize the existing air carrier with their existing service. So that would be just discrimination. It's because there's a tool, a mechanism to allow you, that's in place with the agency to allow you to treat that person differently or that airline differently than another airline who's already serving you. I don't know if that's a very clear example, John, but that's the only one I've got off the top of my head. I appreciate you giving me some advanced warning about it.
That's right. And I think the obvious is also safety related, right? Operating capacities of aircraft and that sort of thing that the FAA measures.
Right. Like if somebody said we want to launch hot air balloons and gliders from Aspen, we would ask for a safety study to be done by our flight standards office, who would then come in and analyze whether that mix of traffic is conducive to a safe operation. And they may say, no, it's not conducive. Therefore, the airport does not have to allow that user. So I guess thank you for leading me down the path, John.
And then if I could ask one more question, Jackie, on the use of airport revenues, Jen, it's my understanding that our environmental goals in terms of being able to mitigate on-airport impacts, so doing solar, net zero, microgrid, battery storage, those sorts of things that benefit the facility and airport directly are still all within our ability to do and fund if we can through passenger facility fees, rental fees, and those sorts of things. Is that a correct interpretation? Just so folks know we can do certain things still with those revenues.
Sure, John. You had me right up until you said PFC, until you said passenger facility.
Oh, I'm sorry. I should not have used PFC.
If you take PFC out of that equation, yes, I believe what you said was accurate and correct, but not PFC at this point.
Great. Thanks for letting me jump in. I've got other questions, but I know other folks are probably waiting.
Okay, Steve.
Mine kind of tags on with that. With the use of revenue generated at the airport, one of the needs of any business here is affordable housing, including our airport staff and the now could that money be used for building affordable housing on airport property or on off airport property? It's not directly aviation related, but it's related to maintaining a stable workforce at the airport.
So it's a very interesting question. You also have a very unique situation that if it were done today wouldn't happen, and that is the residents that are currently on the airport, which the county has been very good to work with the agency over the years and really transitioning that to airport only staff, which is thank you. That makes my job a lot easier when I have to answer tough questions about why are people living on an airport, because technically speaking, not compatible use. So we don't want to see any more residents on the airport. I can take an IOU. I don't know. It's a valid question, right? If the airport owns that asset off airport property, owns the asset and provides it at a reduced rate to, I would have to ask our folks and really get a legal opinion on it. But it's sound in theory, but I would have to get a legal opinion about whether you'd be allowed to do that or not.
Okay, thank you.
Can you tie a bus to it somehow? I mean, if we can tie like multimodal or, I mean, like this, how they're getting,
They live in buses.
Okay, I am going to open it up to public questions. And if you could come up to the mic and introduce yourself, Amory, I'll let you go first.
Make sure the little red light is on. Oh, thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for coming. Amory Lovins, Aspen Flyride. Who is asking for bigger planes? Is it the county or the FAA? And if the county did not ask for bigger planes, could the airport keep its 95-foot limit, the MOS, remain eligible to compete for grants, and keep the grants we already got, excepting perhaps any that were specifically to go to full ADG3 that we then weren't going to do?
So I mean, the county has to answer the part about whether they were asking, because quite honestly, that's what we forced the county's hand back in 2012-ish, 2013, when we started talking about not approving a mod for 320 feet on the west side. And I think a light bulb went off with folks at that point of, oh my goodness, what just happened? So then that facilitated a lot of conversation about the future of air service at Aspen. And that was largely driven by our comments about not allowing a mod on the west side. Drove that conversation, which the county then undertook the 3 studies that are on the airport's website and analyzed what the future of air traffic or air service looked like at Aspen. Then that resulted in us saying, okay, how do we get full design group 3 standards? So that genie's kind of out of the bottle, right? I mean, that it's hard to get that back in the box. So now the agency knows you can meet full group 3 standards. There is a way forward, where before I think there was a lot of question about whether that was going to be able to happen or not. So you can't really go back and say, well, we just want to be treated like we were 10 years ago, because there's been a lot of data that's come out since then. So could you keep it the 95-foot wingspan restriction? Absolutely, but I think I've been fairly clear that we would probably at that point limit your funding to entitlement funding for rehabilitation purposes. So, I mean, that's kind of where we've put that stake in the ground at this point.
I believe your rules do say that if there's a non-standard element of the airport, the sponsor can ask for funding to rehab or repair it, but then it must be brought up to standard if there is a major rebuild going on beyond rehab and maintenance. Is that correct?
That's factual. That's factual, yes.
Mm-hmm. And the reason I asked where the initiative came from to bring in bigger planes is that in 2018, you wrote that the county came to us, to the agency.
And that's correct.
Asking for that.
That's correct.
Okay, so I'm trying.
But caused by, so we're clear, right? We caused that thinking to start, right? Because we said no more mods for 320 feet on the west side. And that was when they came to us with a full parallel taxiway down the west side. And we said no.
I think some would say that actually it was some years before that that the county was pushing for bigger planes. But I don't want to argue about the history. What I'm trying to get clear is when you have made so clear today that you are pushing for a 400-foot separation, is that to any degree contingent on whether the county still wants bigger planes? And the reason for that is that, as you say, a lot of things have changed. And a lot of the things have changed underlay the previous studies you just cited. And some of us feel that the revolution in aviation really changes everything in a way that you don't allow the current ALP to consider, because it's not aircraft already certified.
Right, but we don't have an ability to predict the future. So the agency isn't going to go out on a limb and say, oh, we know this is going to happen and this is going to happen and this is going to happen. Mm-hmm. We are planning based on what is here today and what we foresee in the future through a forecasting process.
Which is to turn the crank on the old model with the old assumptions.
Not necessarily. I mean, there are some new assumptions that have come in. There's some new conversation that's gone on when we've gone back and forth on these working documents. And and we'll continue to have those conversations.
And I think you said.
Amory, I think we need to move to, is there some more public questions?
Thank you.
Really? All right, does the county, yes, Patty?
I have a question. Clearly, I did not see the answer to, did the county ask for bigger planes? Or was it part of a process that if we did X, we would have to be looking at bigger planes? Because my memory serves me pretty clear most often than not, that I don't think the county is necessarily begging for bigger planes to come in here. It's just a matter of the process.
That's correct. I mean, that's how we see it. We've worked through a process with you all previously, and we went through, I mean, I can tell you right now, it was a very elaborate process. Probably one of the most.
In Pickett County?
In Pickett County, in one of the most elaborate processes we've been through, working towards that. And it was not you saying, the county saying to us, we want bigger planes to serve this airport. It was a result of it, kind of an eye-opening is how I would phrase it, is, oh my goodness, I think we may have a problem if we don't start looking at this differently. That's how I would categorize it from my personal standpoint.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify that for the press and for the public and for the members sitting here. And I think you did. Thank you very much.
Let's go to Howie first and then Francie.
Again, thanks so much for your candid responses. Help me try to define what a bigger plane is. And I think that could be applied to this whole room. So is it bigger, are you using as a reference point CRJ 700 as a standard plane and its wingspan and its carrying capacity, or is it a BA 124 that used to fly in here, which I thought was bigger than the CRJs? Help us understand what that means so we can have a little more objectivity to it.
Sure, we've said a few today, right? There's a whole class of aircraft that are out there that are bigger than the CRJ. And that's really when we say bigger aircraft, we're really focused, at least for the conversation we seem to be having on commercial aircraft. There are a whole class of aircraft that have bigger wingspan that are less than 118 feet that are currently not allowed to serve Aspen. So you've heard me bring up a few examples. What was the CS 100 and 300? What's the wingspan? Do y'all remember on like the 300? I don't remember it offhand. I mean, it's hard. We deal with a lot of aircraft, a lot of airports. It is a bigger aircraft. One thing I would like to emphasize to people, and this gets lost a lot. So with that, there is the potential for less frequency, right? When you're talking about more passengers fit on a given airplane, there is an opportunity for less frequency of those aircraft to operate in and out. There also been so many changes in technologies, and this would be evaluated through the environmental processes. What does that noise footprint look like from a bigger aircraft than the ones that are currently using the facility? And I think you'd be shocked. I mean, for a lot of people, a bigger airplane means more noise and more pollution, but in today's age, those newer aircraft, regardless of the manufacturer, typically to be much more fuel efficient because they're trying, right? Airlines are looking for the best bang for their buck from a fuel efficiency standpoint, and they're much quieter. So, and it may be perspective from a quieter, it's kind of a tough thing to quantify at this point, but we would analyze a whole lot of that through an environmental process. That data would become available, and they would be doing comparisons between existing aircraft, which is the CRJ 700, to what could potentially be serving Aspen under those variables. But we don't know about some of the 7.3s. We just don't know their performance capabilities. We had met with, the airport had Bombardier come down during the development of those aircraft and talk with everybody about procedurally, operationally, could they get in and out of the airport, and they assured them they could. So those are now in the fleet. Those Delta Airlines has what's the A220, 100, and 300 in their fleet today, and have placed more orders for the 300. So that's about the aircraft you're looking at.
You only talked about commercial. What about the general aviation side of things?
It would allow for bigger general aviation aircraft.
Okay.
Tyson, can you come up and introduce yourself, please?
Thanks.
Tyson Weiss, pilot, active user of both the commercial and the private side. I heard a couple things. One is we're between a rock and a hard place, and the other is we get 2.4 million in entitlement. And Sarah said 2.4 million doesn't repair much in Aspen. So as a user of the airport, if we don't have a plan and we don't have funding and our runway is failing, as a user of the airport, what can we expect over the next few years in terms of inability to access the airport, whether that's commercial or any other mode? How many months will we not have service? When won't we have service? And what will the impact to users of the airport be during that time?
So all great questions. I don't know the answer to those. It just depends on what needs to be done, when it's done. Obviously, when pavements go to a certain degradation state, they require more to bring them back up to what they need to be to service aircraft. So the longer you wait to do some of that, the more extensive some of that work has to be. But if I had a crystal ball, I'd love to answer your questions. I just don't know. There's a lot of variables involved in that.
I think it's important for the community to know how their access will be affected if we continue to kick the can down the road. Thanks.
And I think one point to that, just talking about, coming back to this entitlement amount. So to give you a rough perspective, since 1982, we've invested $117 million at Aspen.
With a B.
With million.
Okay.
With an M.
All right. Okay.
You just
Thank
upped our
you.
program. We only get $3.5 billion a year nationally. So.
Okay, good to know.
But in the last 20 years, 83.3 of that. So you've seen a pretty dramatic uptick in what we are spending at the facility, and programs of the magnitude that we're talking about are not insignificant. I mean, it will be a big financial lift, and that's why it's so important to get the planning done as soon as possible, because we are now up against time frames, as you're kind of pointing out, that will need to be addressed.
Great, good question.
I think Francie?
Yeah, I just wanted to talk on the environmental side of larger wingspans for just a minute. I mean, you probably know the city of Aspen and the Pitkin County have very aggressive climate action plans that we really want to stick with. And the airport doesn't fit into any of them. Like, it's really hard to fit airplanes into a climate action plan. So, and you spoke to this just a minute ago a little bit, but in my research, it seems to me that the more efficient planes have wider wingspans, which only makes sense because the more wingspan you have, the more efficiently you can fly, it seems to me, unless we go into a whole new generation of vertical takeoff, which I don't want to address. But so if we're headed towards wider wingspan in order to achieve greater or less emissions and greater efficiency and less noise, I'm wondering why we would ever consider, you can't answer this, but I'm wondering why we would ever consider not allowing for that greater wingspan. And my direct question is then, is about, you mentioned about more passengers meaning less frequent landings and takeoffs. So wouldn't that also increase our environmental sustainability significantly if we had a few more people on an airplane with fewer airplanes? I mean, once the airplane's flying, I'm assuming a few passengers doesn't make that much difference environmentally.
Yes, and the key thing for the agency is we can't predict. Like, I can't say today to you that if you go with this bigger aircraft, you're going to have fewer operations. That's all driven by the airlines scheduling those types of things. But from a math standpoint, as several people continue to like to point out, there are only so many pillows, even in the surrounding communities, not just Pitkin County, but down Valley. There are only so many pillows. So at some point, that equalizes somewhat because there's no room at the inn. So I can't tell you today that a bigger aircraft will result in fewer operations, but from a logic standpoint, as you look at that, it would seem to make sense.
And fewer landings and takeoffs would result in fewer emissions, right? I mean, it's pretty straightforward. Thank you.
And from a sustainability, just to add, just if I can, Mr. Peacock brought up an important point, and that is there are things that airports are doing and considering to lessen that impact, right? They're looking at becoming more sustainable. Solar's big, it's big everywhere. And the agency has been able to support the expenditure of airport revenue on those types of uses. So there are ways that airports are trying to be better stewards, and the agency is trying to support that.
Valerie.
It's Valerie Braun from the advisory board. I know you know this, but only 17% of the operations at the airport are commercial and 87% are GA. That's the most recent numbers that we have. And so reducing commercial flights by 3 or 5 is not going to have the impact that we're probably looking for, because so much of what happens at the airport is on the GA side. The community's concern is bigger general aviation aircraft with very few people on it, so they're not efficient. We don't have to go into all the details of that, but my question is, does the FAA ever, I don't know how many other airports are in a similar situation as Aspen, with this big disparity between GA and commercial. Does the FAA ever look at them as being kind of different from say a DIA where it's mostly commercial? Or
We look at things again from a standards and access standpoint, and we don't differentiate between.
And so what we have to come to grips with, I guess, is that if we allow for the 400-foot separation, whether the runway goes wider or not, we get bigger aircraft, at least to 118-foot wingspan, and we have 87% of the operations being general aviation. I think we're looking at a lot more operations overall at the airport because there's no place to park these planes. There's a maximum amount of square footage out there for parking, and so we have a lot of stop and drops. And I'm just conveying to the community one more time, or the community's conveying it to us, that we're tired of having so many aircraft come in here that have so few people on it and impact so many people on the ground. So that's why, and I know you were frustrated in 2018 when we sort of went back to the drawing board, but that's what happened. The community started realizing that, and the county leadership realized the community really wanted to get their point across, and that's what happened. So I'm sorry that you got frustrated with us, and I don't want you to feel anything other than the fact that this is a genuine need in this community to make it better at the airport. That's what it came from.
Not really a question in there, but hopefully you've heard that.
I did ask that question about whether or not there are other airports.
I will just let you know, John Peacock has echoed that sentiment to me at every meeting we've had since that time. Whether it's a phone call or in person, every meeting he has echoed that exact same sentiment.
All right, thanks, John Peacock. Okay, so I'm just going to ask anybody in the public want to ask any more questions. We can keep the board and the AAB going a little bit longer, but I just want to see if there's any more questions from the public.
We have online.
Yes. Go ahead and Craig, is it Craig? Okay.
Yes, hello.
Please introduce
Hello?
yourself. Yes, we can hear you.
My name's Craig Chisesi. I live in Rifle, Colorado. And when you people are talking about stop and drops, I believe they're stopping and dropping at the Garfield County Airport. So you had a little interesting discussion about where we're building things here and here. If you're going to build things under the airport, you can't complain about it. My house was built 4 years before the Rifle County Airport was in existence. And the things that are happening here from what you guys are talking about are, I can chart 35 flights in 2 hours taking off from here. So our airport advertises 12 minutes to Aspen. So people drop people in Aspen, then they park here because obviously we have the better runway, we have the better parking.
Craig, can you get to the question, please?
The question is, how is your climate thing going to affect Rifle and the people here? We are the ones that have no noise restrictions, and they're flying right up over the river and their exhaust, I believe, is coming out from there. So are you guys considering the things around the Aspen Airport and how it affects people like us, Down Valley people, at our airport, which was never supposed to be designed for this?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your time.
I don't know if that was a question for me or you. I apologize.
It's for all of you.
I'll jump in for just a second to answer.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, Greg. This is Francie, the chair of the Pickens County Commissioners. I think we are taking that into consideration. That's why we want to reduce our drop and goes so that we're not sending a bunch of planes to park down in Garfield County. But I have to say that if you want to have noise restrictions and environmental regulations in your county, we can't affect that. That has to be done by your county. But thank you for your input, Craig.
But we don't have a vote in that. Rifle has no vote. The town of Rifle, we have no vote. In fact, the mayor pro tem of our city council runs the Garfield County Airport.
Okay, thank you, Craig. We're going to move to another question from the public. Amory.
I think we all agree that aviation technology is in rapid and unpredictable flux. And I understand why you require a forecasting method based on already existing and certified airplanes. It seems to me, though, that this risks opening up a widening gap between more of what we've had in the past and more of what's rapidly coming at us that is not in your forecasts. This in turn would imply that it's not just what we decide, but when we decide it that matters. It may turn out that it's smarter to consider airside decisions premature and to wait and see if we can, and there's a good argument we can, what evolves, and then build for that once the mist's clear. So we shouldn't be speeding into a fog bank. But if you take the approach you described that basically holds the desperately needed terminal work hostage to doing the airside first, which is the opposite of what the commissioners have contemplated, that kind of turns everything on its head and guarantees premature decisions with a greater risk that they will turn out to be unwise.
I think the
Isn't
question
that a
here
problem?
is this negotiable at all?
From my perspective, no. I mean, and that hasn't changed. And that's why to counter your argument, the agency hasn't flip-flopped on this. The agency's been very consistent, and we've been very consistent for almost, at this point, 12 years in what our expectations were and how those were going to be played out. So if you continue to wait, there's always going to be something new on the horizon. Always. I mean, we're on the upward curve of development for pretty much all technology. So if you decide to wait, when is going to be the right time for you to pull the trigger? So that's a question for you to answer, not me. I'm just laying out for you, this is the agency's position. How you choose to answer your questions at your airport are your issues, but this is where the agency lies.
Well, I thought your approach was very consistent until this meeting, because I've read a lot of what you've written. And what you've said before is that the agency was not saying it's going to take away the modification to standard on separation.
And we're not.
Okay, that's good to hear. So that if the county decided that it wanted to wait and not go straight away for bigger than 95 foot, less than 118 airplanes, we could keep what we've got and continue the MOS. Is that correct?
Yes, but there's caveats to that, right? I mean, we've talked about it. Yeah. We're not going to provide anything other than your entitlement funding at that point. So yes, those are all decisions that are the county's decision to make.
I think you've just made an ironclad case for the county to keep control of the FBO, use the resulting revenue to build the terminal itself, and set its own schedule.
I think that's not really what was said, but anyway, I'll go to Auden.
Okay. So
let's say, this is another issue that's important to the community. Let's say that the community measured pollution and found that there was a lot of pollution from the airport and they wanted to do something about it. You said earlier, FAA can't do that. There's no way to influence it. How do you understand communities' roles in addressing that? What would the tools be available to them? And I know you're not an expert in all regulation. I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
I really don't know the answer to that question. I mean, quite honestly, if the answer is to then restrict something at the airport, the answer would be no, right? I mean, I think we've been pretty clear about that. I don't know, honestly, and I would be more than happy to do some research and get back with you on some of those subjects. And I think that underlying tone kind of fits with some of the previous, hey, we need to get back to you on some of this type of information.
Let's go with Howie, and then we'll go to Steve.
This is both an accountability question and a follow-up to what Valerie was getting at, a sense of trending towards more and more general aviation activity at the airport, when I think there's a preference in the community for reliable, affordable, commercial aviation activity at the airport, bringing more people in on one flight. 50 accidents have happened at the airport. They've all been general aviation. They've shut down the airport. Nobody flies in or out. Commercial aviation is impacted.
Let's get to the question, Howie.
Yeah, the question is, what about the accountability for those general aviation planes that shut the airport down because of bad performance? Is there a mechanism the FAA allows for accountability back to the operator of the airport?
No, I mean, accidents are investigated by the NTSB and flight standards, and they are the regulatory bodies in regards to that. So there's none that I know of.
So there's no financial consequence to causing an accident that disrupts flights for
I don't
a
know the
period of
answer to
time?
that question.
Oh, okay.
Okay, Steve.
Our community has decided that the solution to the separation between the runway and the taxiway is to move the taxiway over to the east, which then requires that the terminal be moved, the air traffic control tower be moved, that FBO facilities be moved further back from the new taxiway. So in essence, building the new terminal is part of that process of moving facilities away from the new taxiway that we are planning that would be at the 400-foot separation. So to me, it seems like if we were building a terminal, that is actually taking a big step towards moving facilities away from the new taxiway and meeting the
This isn't a negotiation, is the question there.
So would that change your mind about, if we were doing that, we are progressing towards
Steve, this is the first time I've heard that.
And did it change your mind?
Not the first time I've heard that.
A few minutes ago.
I mean, and we said there may be an opportunity to do some of that at the same time, but we are not willing to negotiate on that. It's just not, again, we have a history, and there's no reason those things can't happen at the same time. Like today, thinking about it, but there may be some logistical or funding issues that come up as we're working on those. But no, I mean, I understand exactly what you're saying. I understand your argument. It's been made countless times before. And the answer is still the same. We want to see that progression. And yes, we acknowledge that in order to move the taxiway, that stuff is going to have to happen. So there's going to be synergy in that, but it's going to start at the taxiway, and that synergy is going to move to the aprons and the tower and the terminal.
Is that negotiable? Just kidding.
We could probably give you some more opportunities to say no and test your fortitude.
All right, at this point, I'm going to pass it back to Francie.
I think we all really appreciate your time here, John, and your candor, as Howie said. It's really been helpful, and I think there were a couple of surprises for a lot of people, but better to have them now than later. And thank you to everybody who came. We really appreciate your participation and your interest and your input, as always. And with that, I think we will adjourn the work session and get ready to start our regular session at 12:15, a little bit late today.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure.
Thank you so
you.
much.